get started. The time is 10 o'clock. And I will call this meeting of the Lower Savannah-Salkehatchie River Basin County to order. I have it noted as meeting number 11. I think this one still says 10. I don't know if that matters or not.
I did change it when I sent it out to stakeholders, but
Mom catches my.
It is 11, right?
Yeah,
It is
11
11.
on mine, yeah.
Officially our 11th meeting called to order. As you all have seen, we're going to be talking about policy, legislation, and regulatory recommendations today. So hopefully you had a little opportunity to read up and be ready for that. At this time, I will ask for an approval of the agenda. Motion by Ken, second by Dean. All in favor? Raise your hands. Any opposed? Okay, and then we have some minutes from our November 7th meeting that were sent out. Other than maybe any corrections you received, any other comments on the minutes? Okay, if not, I'll entertain a motion that we approve those. Dean, second by Bill. All in favor? Aye. Okay. And then before we get started, does anyone have any newsworthy items that we want to
Yeah, so last time we talked a little bit about the Sentinel Landscape Program, and Courtney was going to follow up. She provided the slide and map.
Yeah.
Courtney, you want to just.
Yeah, there's not a lot more to say than what I said before, but it is, I just wanted to show a map of that region. So that purple outline is the low country Sentinel landscape. It's about 22 million acres. You can see the counties that it includes. And the idea with the Sentinel landscape is it's a partnership between those 4 federal agencies to ensure compatible land use surrounding military installations. There is another look, I think this one's the 11th Sentinel landscape that was approved in the country. And there are more now, but there is one that's on the other side of the Savannah that picks up in Georgia. So there are 2 Sentinel landscapes that sort of abut and are influenced by this watershed. In the low country Sentinel landscape, with the sort of the epicenter of that being in the Beaufort area with Paris Island and the air base and the Navy hospital, the 5 priorities for that particular landscape are listed here. So those are the goals, and I didn't list all of the goals, but around climate resilience, supporting imperiled species, conserving and protecting working landscapes, local federal partnerships to be able to support that. But the one I highlighted is around water quality. It's a little bit of it's a little unclear because the goal is water quality and protecting source water quality and supplies through landscape scale conservation. We had a working group meeting with that group this week to try to figure out what does that mean. What are the challenges to water quality, and a lot of it was around PFAS. And not as much around quantity, but it's sort of a fluid goal. And so it's evolving a little bit in terms of what are the specific goals and objectives and the issues and priorities. I mean, the takeaway from this is those 4 federal agencies are able to compile money and match funds for projects that advance that goal. So as this plan sort of evolves and becomes an operational plan, there may be funding available to be able to implement projects that are identified to meet that goal, which is protecting source water. And to the extent that it abuts another landscape that's on the other side of the Savannah, there may be even more of an argument. So it's worth knowing that we are in this landscape. And that there's a lot of attention and a lot of potential support and funding for this work.
So in your plan, your road basin plan that you're writing, in chapter 9, you're going to be putting together recommendations. We're going to start talking about those today. One of the recommendations you can make is what you want to study and what you support, whether it be through funding or technical resources or whatever, in subsequent phases of planning. And we're not really touching water quality during this phase, but other RBCs have said, here's what we want to look at during subsequent phases. And sometimes they mention specific aspects of water quality, like the Upper Savannah mentioned specifically DO and bacterial impairments or something, parts of it. So that's one of the things they want to look at. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about your technical recommendations and your funding related recommendations. And whether you want to use that to potentially reference this program and leverage funding from those 4 different agencies. So just keep it in mind.
And just a quick question, this obviously is in our area, does the state of South Carolina have any other Sentinel programs underway or being seriously considered?
I don't believe so.
And when you said PFAS was what was mentioned for water quality, that was specific to this one or to the Sentinel Landscape Program across the nation?
Well, I guess around across the nation,
Okay.
but in this area, I mean, I think the conversation was, you know, the new EPA regulations around PFAS and drinking water are coming down, we all know, they're coming down the line and it's unfunded mandate. So the concerns around like, what does that really look like? And, you know, in this particular instance, you know, drinking water isn't necessarily, when we were talking about this, there is some groundwater coming from this, but a lot of it's coming from the Savannah. So it's not even within the scope of the landscape that you can control the PFAS. It's getting ported in. So you're just having to deal with it. So PFAS being forever chemicals. So we have, you know, the air base and we have lots of sources of potential forever chemicals. So that.
And the cost of you for Jasper to deal with the PFAS regulations which are coming out of EPA. $150 million, $200 million. Ridiculous, incredible.
And that's knowing what we know. We don't know what. Are you guys having to look at that yet?
Our groundwater sources did not identify this.
We didn't either, so we opted out of it completely. Just said it's not worth us because we don't have anything there.
So they did like an initial analysis test.
Nothing yet. But, you know,
Nothing yet. I mean, you know.
until the, until the analysis.
And they'll eventually say, well, you didn't go in the first place, so, you know, I mean, but we're just not, it's just not worth that. It's not worth staying in. And we'll. Yeah.
All right, any other questions? No way. All right, thank you, Courtney. Before we do public and agency comment, Tom, you want to just list off the RBC members that are attending virtually?
Great. Make sure I got everybody. Larry Hayden, Will Williams, Leslie Dickerson, Brad Young, Brian Kimsack, and Jeff Hines.
Okay, and online folks, today it's pretty much all discussion, so we'd love for your input. Don't hesitate to unmute yourself and chime in or raise your hand and Tom could acknowledge you, but we want to encourage you to be part of the discussion, even though you're virtual. Okay, public and agency comment. Any members of the public attending online or agency members want to make comment? Okay, and I will mention we did kind of reorganize the agenda a little bit from how we left it at the end of our last meeting. You recall we were going to talk about groundwater demands, and Alex Pellet was going to present those, and Brooke then was going to piggyback on that and talk about how those demands might impact, or would they impact trends that we're seeing in groundwater resource availability. So provide some information in lieu of the modeling, which is not going to be done. We decided to move that to January to give them more time. Brooke was in the middle of doing synoptic water level measurements and needed a little more time to finish up the demand projections. That also works well though too, because in its place, we're going to talk about policy, regulatory, and legislative recommendations. The Water SC group is, if you remember, required to provide a report to the Surface Water Study Committee by the end of January. And the focus of that report is on the state of surface water resources and potential changes to law. So one thing we're doing is compiling all of the policy, regulatory, and legislative recommendations from the other RBCs that have already developed their recommendations or in the process of finalizing their recommendations, and providing those to Water SC so they can see what collectively all the RBCs have come up with, what improvements they think could be made, what recommendations they have for improving the law or regulation or even policy. So that meeting where the Water SC group is going to talk about that is next Thursday, the 12th. So by you all starting to have that discussion, we can pass along anything that you might come to consensus upon or whatever your considerations are. So the timing works well, of getting this last RBC, or not the last one, the Santee is the last one, but they haven't even started meeting yet, but at least getting your feedback yet. So that's one reason why we've moved that up to the agenda today too. Okay, really quickly, what we talked about last month was primarily finishing up drought response recommendations. And we talked about water management strategies. As far as drought response, RBC decisions and recommendations, we decided for our communication plan, unlike the Upper Savannah, which said, get rid of the DMA areas and re-coordinate them based on the river basins and provide representation from the river basin councils. Y'all generally agreed that, well, as long as there's a river basin council member on the DRC representing the DMAs, then that's probably sufficient. So that's what we've currently got in for the structure and communication plan. And then we settled on those 4 recommendations, which were similar, if not identical, to a lot of the other RBCs. For water management strategies, I'm going to leave that review of the discussion until we get to that topic later in the meeting, if we get through technical or till we get through our recommendations discussion. So we'll touch on those water management strategy refresher later. Okay, so let's dive right into policy, legislative, regulatory recommendations. I mentioned that Chapter 9 of the River Basin Plan is all about recommendations, your recommendations. And they generally fall per the planning framework into 3 categories. Planning process recommendations. So that's this process. How do you think it's working? Do you see ways to improve it? Do you think it should be continued, discontinued? So we'll look for your recommendations on that. Usually we start with planning process recommendations. We've flipped it around a little bit so we can begin with the 3rd one, policy, regulatory, and legislative recommendations. We're going to come back to planning process recommendations later, but because we want to inform Water SC, who meets next week, about the 3rd item there, policy, regulatory, legislative, we're doing that first. The other one is then technical recommendations. So that could be related to modeling or tools or monitoring or further areas of study, anything kind of technical related. And typically, the other river basin councils have identified the most number of recommendations in that category. So we'll come back to those as well. We can talk about those. We'll probably begin planning process and technical recommendations maybe in January, if not certainly in February, and hope we can wrap everything up for Chapter 9 recommendations by March. So today we're going to talk about policy, regulatory, and legislative recommendations, and what can those be? Those can be modifications to existing state law or even local laws, regulation, or ordinances. You can recommend new state or local laws, regulation, and ordinances, ideas for recurring funding for water planning work, or even restructuring groups or agencies. But the focus of what we're going to talk about today is existing state law and primarily surface water law. That's where there has been both litigation, ongoing litigation, and a lot of discussion around what could be done to improve the surface water law, which was enacted in 2011. So everybody have a good understanding of what we're going to talk about for the next hour and a half or so, at least. Did you all happen to read that land grant press summary of surface water law and regulation? See some nods. Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting name. Is that because the university is a land grant organization?
It's just the name they picked out. Sorry, them.
Okay.
I work with them because I do the Journal of South Carolina Water Resources, but I never asked why the name is that. I would guess it's just because it's the name of the school.
Yeah. Okay. Is Joe Kuhn online or anybody else from DES? Yep. Joe is okay.
Several folks.
Joe and others from DES. I added some of 4 of your slides just as a quick refresher in case some of you didn't get a chance to read that land grant press summary. And here's where I want to clear up any questions if anybody has about surface water law I'm just gonna quickly go through these 4 or 5 slides, and Joe, chime in, or Leanne, or Brooke, or Scott, or whoever's online, if I say something incorrect. Surface water law was passed in 2011. Regulations were promulgated in 2012. It establishes a system for permitting and registering withdrawals that are over 3 million gallons in any month. So there's a threshold, and that threshold is pretty typical for other states as well. There are 3 types of withdrawals: existing, which we'll refer to also as grandfathered withdrawals. Those were those that were in place before 2011. And then we've got new, and we've got agricultural. So kind of 3 different categories that have different standards that apply to them. For determining permitted and registered permit volumes for new users, there's the safe yield definition. That's where there's been a lot of discussion and even some potential litigation around that. It has to do with 80% of the mean annual daily flow and using that as a definition for safe yield. There's also minimum in-stream flows in the law and regulation. And we've talked about those in the past. We even did some comparisons of model results to minimum in-stream flows to see what the frequency of time at certain locations does flow drop below minimum in-stream flows. And if you remember, even in those unimpaired flow scenarios that we looked at, you see there's a certain amount of time where flows in the rivers and streams are below the minimum in-stream flows, below 20, 30, or 40% of the mean annual daily flow. Okay, so those are 2 concepts that are part of the law: safe yield and minimum in-stream flow. Existing withdrawals, so those that were in place before 2011 are grandfathered. They're not subject to minimum in-stream flows, so that's an important distinction. It's been a point of discussion amongst other RBCs. The existing or grandfathered withdrawals account for 94% of the permits statewide. It may be 100% of the permits in the lower Savannah-Salkehatchie, but Joe or Leanne or Brooke, do you know for surface water? I'm trying to think if there's any new permittees in either of these basins, and I can't think of any.
I can't think of any either.
Yeah,
The basin's 100% permitted.
100% allocated. Yeah, so we'll talk about that in a second.
Okay.
That last bullet's an important point too. That's a point of discussion, or could be that most of the permits were based on the design capacity of the intake structure that was in place. That may mean that some folks that receive permits have permits for a lot more water than they currently need, or even anticipate needing in the next 30, 40, 50 years or beyond. Any questions about that or those concepts? Do I understand that?
And these would have been existing, since this rule was promulgated 2011, 2012, these were existing, and they would have been permitted under, in what time frame? Like in the 93 or 2000 timeframe? Or I guess my next question is, when did they expire?
So, yeah, so DES folks, these ones that were grandfathered that are permits, they go for 30 years.
Between 30 and 50 years. So like the slide shows, they were, when the permit was issued in, I believe 2011 or 2012, it's from that point. So it's not from when they were originally reporting water use. It was once we promulgated the law and we issued permits, it was 30 to 50 years from that point. So most of them expire and, a long time from now.
2040, 2060.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Leanne, is a majority of them 30 or 50 or?
I'd have to look. I want to think the majority are 30, but I'd have to look. I think, well, actually, yeah, I'd have to look. A lot of them are like that 40 year.
Okay. Like Brian and Dean, do you know what Beaufort Jasper's Savannah withdrawal is? Is it 30 or 50? Yeah, Brian.
I don't know off the top of my head. I could pull it up and look, but
Okay, just
If I
curious.
remember correctly, it's 30 years.
30.
And the key thing on that last one is that it's not the design capacity of the intake structure as a whole. It's the largest piece of that intake structure. So if there's a really big pipe that has the ability to carry an enormous amount of water, even though the pump station, for example, that's lifting the water may not have that capacity, it's the largest piece of that intake structure that sets the number that can be, that's permitted. So, you know, this is the biggest problem I think we have, in my opinion, with the current law. Other than not agricultural permits rather than simply acknowledged. But this is really important. We're allocating water that'll never get used. And maybe that's good for the environment. I mean, maybe we can say, well, we've allocated it, but it'll never be used, so it's good to have it flowing in the stream. It's really, it's difficult. It's very difficult to make it.
It's a trade-off. I mean,
Yeah.
some may say it limits growth and economic development, but others may say it supports the environment. I guess we need to find out what that middle ground is. Okay,
There was a question online. Do these permits allow for storing water long-term?
I don't think there's discussion of that in law or regulation, but Leanne or Joe, want to speak to that?
So, I mean, that's not really part of the permit. Some sites, if they have on-site storage, that would be something that would, you know, those are very permit by permit. So it's a site-specific issue. So if someone is withdrawing out of a lake or something, I mean, it might mention that, but a lot of times, you know, if you're looking at like new permits, we may say if they need a separate, you know, backup contingency plan for a new permit, they may have on-site storage and that could be their backup. But these grandfathered permits, it wouldn't necessarily include that because they were just going by wherever their intake is located. I don't see why we wouldn't allow for on-site storage for long-term, you know, contingency, but that's not really something that was part of these grandfathered permits.
Yep.
If that makes sense.
I think it does, yep. Okay, for new withdrawers, and again,
Sorry, there's one more question.
oh, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Are the organizations subject to these laws self-reporting? If so, is there an audit mechanism?
Leanne, you want to go ahead and answer that one?
Sure. So everyone that has a permit or registration is required to report their water use. So it is self-reporting, but we now have our e-permitting system, so they're able to do it online through that. But we also send out a hard copy paperwork for everyone as well. But it is all self-reported. The only audit mechanism is if you have a permit, we do have the ability to go on site and check your water use records.
Okay, any more comments, Tom? Yeah. All right, new withdrawers. So anybody that didn't have a permit already, when the law came out, was a new withdrawer. If they're not ag, they get a new permit, and apply for a permit. Withdrawers are evaluated for reasonableness if you're seeking a permit. That's an important point we're going to come back to later. There's a public notice day. Those durations are 20 to 50 years. Again, withdrawers are subject to those minimum stream flow requirements. New ones are. So they need to have a contingency plan in place and potentially another source of water if they want to keep using water if stream flows drop below those minimum stream flows. Everyone understand that?
A question tied to the last one. At the end of your permit duration, do you fall under the new permit or you re-grandfather? Do you fall into the second category?
Yeah.
No.
Go ahead, Leanne.
Oh, yeah, so that's correct. No. If you're a grandfather existing permit, once the permit expires, you would just reapply to essentially renew the permit, and based on our law and reg, it would be issued for the same quantity as the existing permit was originally issued for.
regardless of usage,
Yes,
and then not measured against the minimum in-stream flow.
So
no, they would not be subject to any of the minimum issue flow requirements.
So it's like being grandfathered.
Yeah, so the permit time is just.
you just become great grandfather.
Good question.
So
Where's the management in the process? I mean, it seems to me that there is no.
there is no law,
The new guys,
basically.
you guys get screwed and the old guys can.
There is no
continue doing what they're doing forever.
That's one of the biggest challenges.
So why have it?
Yeah.
Well, it was a, let's call it a first step, because we have any, so everybody that was involved in the negotiation of that process. Ultimately, this is where the negotiation ended. Politically in the state,
Lobbyists.
there's a lot of power in a lot of areas where folks don't want the state telling them how much to take or what they can use or whatever. So this is what we got to. The question is, I think, key for this process is, can we survive on this? And my answer is no, we can't. We've got to change it. How we change it, I don't know, but we've got to figure that out.
Well, I think simply, if you have that much time to understand how you affect the in-stream flow, you can start to adapt. You have 20 to 30 to 50 years. You don't adapt at all, and you just get renewed. There's nothing driving you.
No incentive for change. If you're not being forced.
So I don't know the answer either. I don't think, if you were always doing that and then a new regulation comes in that constrains you, that may not be right either. So the answer is somewhere in the middle, but you have 30 to 50 years to adapt. And I would think.
Yeah, going back to the discussion about the EPA forcing the regulations on us with the PFAS. Where's the middle ground? I mean, they're doing that to us, but yet there's no regulation here. So there's no middle ground. I mean, this doesn't make sense.
Well, EPA has come in and told the state that it will not, it won't accept the process that we currently have for this. They've told the state, you've got to regulate. And I think ask folks online to kind of clarify that, because I know that there was a request, and because of EPA's response, revisions were made, attempted to be made while we were meeting with the people. The DHEC people at that time tried their best to come up with a alternative approach. And ultimately, we talked a lot about it in the DPAC, but it never went anywhere. And it's lurking out there. But it was in response to an EPA statement that said, we're not going to respect what you've done here because we don't think you've done it right. And, so I don't know quite where we are with that, but it clearly a bunch of people had some guys.
Another comment, are there regulations on the measurement systems organizations use to report usage?
Leanne, do you want to speak to that?
So we do require them to tell us how they're going to measure their usage as part of their application. Most larger users do have flow meters, but we do just request that they tell us how they're doing it so we can better understand how they're getting to their numbers. And we do have a kind of a list listed in the regulation of different kind of options that we kind of recognized, but it's not specific, like you have to have a flow meter. They just have to have something that measures it. But it's not specific in that it has to be one specific way to do it.
Do y'all then take that and turn it into a uniform measurement?
Well, they submit the measurement. So we send them out some paperwork that requests their water use in million gallons a month, and they fill it out and send it back. So we should be getting how much water they're using. we don't get the like power usage or however they're measuring it. We just get the actual volume per month.
That reporting is critical to any
Yeah.
water resource management that we're doing. I mean, we've used it to, help build these models. It's necessary to figure out, are we overusing the resource or do we have room to grow? So it is important, and having reliable reported data is also important.
But we don't know that this is reliable, like it's all self-reported based on. Not even prescribed measurements, like they can measure it however they want.
Well, I think Leanne said there's, some requirements around.
I can look up what it says in the reg and copy and paste what it says into the chat, just so you know, like the different systems that we request them to list if it's one of those. But yeah, I mean, even though it is self-reported, there are people don't have really there's no benefit to not telling us how much they're using, especially if a grandfathered user, they already have such a large permit volume. They're not really getting anything out of it by not telling us how much they're using. And it benefits them because when we go to look at other, if a new user comes in, we can more accurately determine if someone can come in or not. Because if you underreport, then we could be taking water away from that user. If you overreport, there are issues that come up with that, but it doesn't necessarily benefit somebody to not report correctly, if that makes sense. And we do have the ability to go audit on site their water usage. That is something we do have the ability to do.
Can I ask a question to follow up on what Dean was mentioning about EPA? Saying that the existing regulation is not acceptable. Is there work being done? I mean, aside from the process that we're going through and other basins are going through, is there work being done to reimagine or revise this process to meet EPA's needs? What should I ask?
So, well, I mean, the Surface Water Study Committee that was the legislators on it, their goal, I guess, is to decide, do we need to make revisions? And they're looking from Water SC, from that group, to suggest revisions. We're using the RBC process to help inform them. Well, that's one method. Leanne or Joe, I don't know if you can speak to what the status is of that EPA letter from a year and a half or 2 years ago, or litigation since then that's come up.
I can try to speak generally about it. It's really more of a specific issue about a narrative flow standard and applying it to a different set of regulations. And so there was a notice of drafting of that regulation, and there was some comments to see if there was a stakeholder interest in modifying that regulation, and that didn't result in any outcome. If that helps.
Okay.
Another question.
Yeah.
Is there a standard for the amount of uncertainty or error in the measurements?
Leanne, I'd say probably no, but can
No.
you?
Yeah, no. There's not. Also, I did look it up. Majority of permits were issued for 30 years, and there were just a select few issued for 40 years. And then I don't see any that were issued for 50 years. So just wanted to let you know I looked that up real quick.
Since they're re-grandfathered, I'm not sure that really makes much difference whether it's 30, 40,
No,
or 50. So,
it doesn't, but just want to let you know I looked it up.
Yeah.
In case they go out of business.
There you go. Yeah. Okay. Again, new withdrawers, they are subject to having to meet those minimum stream flow requirements. They're subject to safe yield regulations. So there's a difference whether you have an existing permit and you don't have to meet those, or you're a new user, like a new industry. New industry has to abide by minimum stream flow and safe yield, and have that contingency plan, which typically would be, relying on a different source like groundwater. Okay, and then there's agriculture. Agriculture was just,
That's a really quick question.
Yeah.
So the grandfather bonds. For that, so this is accounts for 94% of permits. Is that in this defined basin?
no, I think what we heard from Leanne is that in the Savannah, or excuse me, yeah, lower Savannah-Salkehatchie, there are no new permits since 2011 for surface water. So everything's grandfathered. They're all existing, 100%. The 94% statewide.
Statewide.
Question, do the permits go with the land? Meaning if I buy something that's permitted and grandfathered, take it over to my grandfather too?
So Leanne, you want to speak to that and how it works for different types of use?
So a permit can be transferred. So if, let's say you have an industry and you decide to sell it and you want to transfer the permit with that, you can do it. However, currently, as it states in the law and reg, it can only be transferred like for like. So an industrial intake can be transferred to another industrial use, but you cannot transfer it from an industrial use to a water supply, for instance. However, agricultural registrations cannot be transferred. So if you're a farmer and you decide you're going to retire and you want to sell the land and someone else is going to come on and use the land, they would have to apply for a new registration.
Sell the land for another purpose other than ag.
Well, no, but I'm saying like if a farm, like let's say a new farmer is going to come in and try to farm the land, because so agricultural registrations are just completely different animal from permitted users completely. If someone wanted to buy the land and then build an industrial site there, they would still have to get a new permit because you can't do like for like regardless, but that's also a registration to a permit. So you can't do that either. But agriculture users in general cannot transfer. So if I'm a farmer and I'm retiring and I'm selling the land to another farmer and they want to use that intake, they would have to reapply for a new registration.
Let me ask for a clarification there. If I'm a farmer and I have a corporation that I have, Joe Smith's Farm, Inc., and I sell Joe Smith's Farm, Inc. to another owner, the company doesn't change. The owner of the company changes. Does the new owner of Joe Smith's Farm, Inc. have to go and start over again?
As long as the registration was made in that, like if the corporation was listed as the owner of the registration, you could do that. But a lot of times they were made by the person, not a corporation. But theoretically, yes, if a corporation were to make the registry, like put them down as put a corporation down as the owner of the registration, if someone else was the new contact for it, I don't see why you can't do that.
How about for water suppliers that supply to industry? Because
Well, that's different. So a water supplier, they already do that, right? A lot of water suppliers do supply water to industrial users. So that's just, changing their customer base. But the intake itself, the use of it to, you can't change the use for the intake from, but a water supplier can, they sell whoever they want. That's what they do.
Question.
Yeah.
So to be a correct summary to say that organizations self-report usage as measured by one of the approved methodologies with unknown accuracy. However, the state can review how the company measures and reports their data.
Yeah, I think so, right, Leanne? That's a fair statement.
Yeah.
Yep.
I believe so.
Okay. Okay. We withdraw. Okay, we're on agricultural registrations. So agriculture, and do we have anybody are any ag folks online?
Actually, no, I don't think so.
I know Angel wasn't able to be here. Brad's not here.
Brad, you move on.
And you're still talking about surface water here, right?
Talking about surface
Ag,
water.
surface
Yeah,
water.
yeah. Okay.
Which in our basin, remember the numbers.
Well, in Salkehatchie, pretty much all the water uses for ag from surface water and groundwater. We don't have any other surface water uses other than ag and the Salkehatchie.
Right. And the Savannah portion.
Yeah, it's more of a mix. Okay, so agricultural registrations, they also have to report their use. And they don't necessarily have to meter their use. They could use some other method to estimate their use, correct? So there's a little more
Right, and-
uncertainty in ag.
Yeah, a lot of times an ag user will base it on like time they've run the pumps or how much, their power bill a lot of times for running their pumps for their intakes, that sort of thing. And those calculations are out there. You can do that. But yeah, so a lot of times they don't have flow meters or whatever on their pumps.
So again, less certainty in the reported ag usage. But for the most part, the ag usage is typically lower than permitted uses. Not
Right.
always, but often it is.
Yep.
Like very low, like barely above threshold. But it all varies, depends on the size, how much irrigation they're doing, whether it's a wet year or dry year, a lot of variation. The ag registrations are new ones, are subject to safe field calculations, but they're not subject to minimum stream flow. And they're not subject to reasonable use requirements. On the groundwater side, if you go for a groundwater registration, you are required to demonstrate reasonable use. That means you have to basically say, okay, I'm going to be, using this to irrigate 100 acres of 1 or 2 or 3 different crop types, and I need this much water. For surface water, you don't have to, for a surface water registration, you don't have to say what the reasonable use is. It would be, Leanne, tell me if I say something wrong, but it could be based on whatever you request generally. And that has potentially resulted in, not potentially, it has resulted in, I don't want to call it a loophole necessarily, but in the Edisto Basin, and I believe we talked about this before, and then the Black Creek and the PD Basin, there's been some registrations for agricultural water use that have taken up the entire remaining safe yield of the basin. And that was done purposely because they saw that you don't need to demonstrate reasonable use. So there's several, 2 or 3 permits in the Edisto where they've asked for very, very large volumes of water, and DES has, following the regulation and law, has had to allocate that to them. That has resulted in the Edisto Basin and parts of the PD being fully allocated, meaning that now a new farmer that wants to come in to get an agricultural registration can't. They have to apply for a permit. And then they're subject to minimum stream flows and that safe yield. But mainly the minimum stream flows is the important part, because when it's a drought, that's when they really need to irrigate, and they're required to find another source or stop their irrigation. So that's one of the challenges that's been discussed amongst the RVCs. And that's one where there's been general consensus about reasonable use requirements, like they apply for groundwater, should apply for surface water. And we'll get to that in a minute. But it's the one area where there's been pretty strong consensus. Does that make sense? Okay.
John, to what extent does this permit process lend itself to monetizing the value of these permits? And decisions are made on the future use or continued use of the land and the withdrawal that's tied to that parcel.
I'm not
So
sure
is
how to
your
answer
land
that.
worth more as a result of the permit you have, regardless of whether you're using it or not?
I don't think, because it's not, the permit or registration is not tied to the land, it's tied to the applicant, right? So I don't know that you can look at it that way.
Talking water rates.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, this is not, we're not talking about, Western type of water law where there's, prior appropriations and grandfathering, not the grandfather we've been talking about, but here it's all riparian. And it's based on the applicant, not the land necessarily. So I don't think you could suggest, oh, I've got this permit for water and my 50 acres is a lot more valuable than this guy's because he doesn't have a permit for water. That doesn't really apply under this.
So is it a straight hedging move that has occurred to hedge against future surface water withdrawals
Well,
on the Edison?
in the Edisto, it was primarily done as a conservation measure by conservation-minded folks that says, hey, we want to lock up the remaining amount of water or make it difficult to do new withdrawals. So make you have to apply for a permit, which is more expensive, and then you have to abide by minimum stream flows, and you have to curtail your withdrawal during drought times so that you don't drop below that minimum stream flow. Yep. Okay. All right, that's a quick overview of hopefully what you read in that land grant press summary and presentations that Leanne and or Joe have given prior. But any remaining questions before I jump into what some of the recommendations have been made to address those issues?
This may be going back a year. But is there? So you're saying that if all of the water is allocated under the registration process, it defers back over to permit, right? That, which would suggest that there is 100% denominator, there's a total allocation. Is there a predetermined division of what is a registration water? That's like, how much of that is registration versus permit?
No, there's not so the registration and permits all go towards the same safe yield of the basin.
So it's 100% of safety,
Right.
whatever that
Yeah,
denominator.
there's not a separate bucket for each.
Okay.
You know, if they're looking to approve a permit versus a registration, they're just looking at what's the remaining safe yield in the basin at that point, regardless of whether it's a permit or a registration.
So if in like the Edisto, 100% of that available safe yield was registered, then they had to go apply for a permit. What are they like?
Well, it's both registered and permitted. So there's already permits in the basin and there's registrations in the basin. Those cumulative ones, plus the new ones that came in, then basically took up the remaining safe yield. So now you only can apply for you can only apply for a permit now.
Well, there's nothing to apply for.
But there's no money, there's no.
Well, you can. So you can exceed the safe yield of the basin by applying for a permit, and that's DES could approve it if they think there's enough water still, but then you're subject to those minimum stream flows. So they're going to say, most of the time we've got enough water. It's okay if we exceed that safe yield, but when there's drought times, we don't want you drying up the stream. Leanne, is that a fair way to characterize it?
Yeah, and a lot of it is to do with because permits have different requirements, such as needing contingency plans. So we can say when you apply for X amount, okay, the safe yield isn't there. So, and you have to meet, the main thing is meeting those minimum entering flow requirements. And when you cannot meet those, you would need to default on your backup plan, essentially. So do you have wells? Do you have on-site storage? That sort of thing. So that's essentially why you can still apply for a permit rather than get a registration, because registrations don't have that qualification. They're only tied to safe yield, whereas permits are tied to that minimum stream flow. Big problem with permits though, for a lot of, like, if a new ag user comes in and can't get a registration, it's cost prohibitive because of the application fee is $7,500 for a new permit. And a lot of times that would be cost prohibitive for a small farmer just trying to come in and get a registration.
Question, and I don't think this necessarily applies so much to us. But in the Edisto, depending where you are in the basin, you may be in a different situation in the upper basin than in the lower basin. In other words, you may be in a situation where the minimum in-stream flow has been reached in the upper basin. As you go further down, more streams are coming in from the sides, and you have more water available to be permitted in the lower part of the basin. How does DES deal with that? How did the plan, let me ask, how did the Edisto plan deal with that situation?
Well, I'm not sure we dealt with it directly. And I don't know how DES deals with it. Is there 3 registrations, Leanne, that came in the Edisto that basically tied up that remaining water, or just 3?
There were 1, 2, 3. There were 4 registrations, one had 2 intakes, so it was 5 intakes across 4 registrations. But there was like these 2 in particular that tied it up. But yeah.
And they were at different points of the North Fork, or were 1 or 2 of them on the Edisto after the North and South came together? I think they were all.
I believe the 2 big ones were after the confluence.
Okay.
I could double check, but I'm fairly certain those 2 big ones were after the confluence, but I'll double check.
Are these, I guess, over allocations, if you want to look at it that way, are they done for conservation purposes, as you said, or are these, big ag trying to block other big ag from moving in?
Mhm. I believe they were for conservation purposes. Okay, yeah.
Could that organization sell sublet the rights, if you will, to somebody else to use that water that they've registered for?
No, because they're registrations and they can't be transferred that way. Right, Leanne?
That's an interesting question. Because I get that, I get what you're asking, because you're not asking that they are transferring it. You're saying I'm keeping, let's say I get a registration and then I pump the water, but I sell that water to somebody. Right? That's kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, that, or somebody in the next property puts in a pump and
It's
pumps
reworded.
it out.
So I feel
But-
like at that point they would become a water supplier and not a registration. So they would be subject to a permit rather than a registration. Because we would be asking, how are you using this water? And, if you're selling it, then you become a water supplier rather than, an ag irrigator or whatever. But that's an interesting question, and I would have to look more into that to have a better answer.
Okay. Yep. The point being, is there any value to the registrant for overstating how much water they're going to use? Can they make money off of it, basically?
Right. And like I said, I would have to look into that more. But I would imagine if they plan to, sell it to somebody around them, then they would become a different type of user. They're no longer a registration. They are now a permit because they're selling it. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
But I would have to look into that more to have a better answer.
Okay. Thank you.
Without you knowing the sublet.
Is there another comment on the chat or?
No, it was Jeff.
Okay.
I mean, it just seems to me it's a flawed process. So how do you comment on a flawed process? The process needs to be changed. There's no way to really regulate water in South Carolina.
Yeah.
It's a bottom line. I mean,
Yep, so that's a good feed into some of the recommendations to fix that we're going to talk about from some of the other RBCs. So I think I sent you all a 3 or 4 or 5 page summary of organized by River Basin Council with their recommendations, and I tried to highlight at the end of each recommendation which councils had very similar or identical recommendations. We're going to go through them in kind of the order of, we're going to first talk about recommendations that deal with reasonable use. Then we're going to talk about grandfathered use. And we're going to talk about permits versus registrations. And then a few other things like safe yield and minimum stream flow and some of the recommendations that other RBCs have made around that. So for this next part, I'm going to introduce these recommendations from our other RBCs for your consideration. And then during the next agenda item, we're actually then going to decide, okay, do we like some of these? Is there consensus behind them? Is there a majority support behind them? Do we want to adopt these? Do we want to think about them further? You need to take as long as you want, I guess, to, if you're not comfortable making recommendations today and voting on them, especially since we don't have any ag representation here, I don't want to miss that important voice in our group. So I don't think we're going to be able to adopt anything, but what we can certainly do is document what you all have decided at a subsequent meeting, we need to make sure we have ag here so they can provide a voice for the community, their ag community, because I'm sure they want to chime in on issues like this, reasonable use, because it affects them when, the basin gets over allocated and they can't apply for registration, they have to apply for a permit. That sucks. They don't want to do that. They have some strong feelings typically about whether there should just be one system for all. So get rid of registrations and everybody has to get a permit, or you should keep registrations for agricultural water use and permits for everybody else. So I want to hear their voice on that too.
Leanne put in the chat, she looked in the larger registrations we were discussing around the South Fork before the confluence.
Okay.
North Fork.
Okay.
So not happening.
So I don't think we really fully answered your question, Dean. I'm not sure how to answer it actually.
That's all right.
But it's an interesting question.
Another question.
Yeah.
And part of it, of course, is that we don't have very good database along a lot of these rivers. So we have water quality. We have water capacity sampling measuring stations here, maybe one down here, but there's very little data showing exactly what the actual flows are in various points in the system.
Yeah, on the Edisto, there's a fair number of evenly dispersed gauges. I felt like we had a good amount of gauges on the main stem Edisto, North, South Fork, and then combined. Now, on other parts of the Edisto, like Fort Hole Swamp area, it's really hard to gauge that area. There's not as much good information, reliable data.
Just one question that to me is interesting out there.
Yeah.
Because I know in the Edisto, for example, the city of Charleston uses or used to use a lot of Edisto water. They basically have what would be prescribed in the old days for water rights, a significant amount of water out of the Edisto for drinking water in the Charleston area. And that affects, of course, everything that happens upstream because their demand is very specific, and it's to the extent we were going to have it be historic. They have been drawing water on that river basin for years and years.
Yeah, and they still are. And I think one reason they like that source is that it's high quality, good quality source. It reduces their treatment cost. Okay, so let's talk first about one recommendation, and it's been tweaked a little bit by the Upper Savannah that has to do with reasonable use, because that's the one where we've seen the most consensus. So we'll talk about this one, and then we'll take a short break and come back and talk about the other ones. So the Broad, the PD, the Edisto, and let me clarify this too. The Edisto, when they discussed and debated recommendations, they were the first group to do this, and they did not come to consensus on any of these recommendations, but they did a vote. We documented what the results of the vote were. So you can consider some of these, you can consider the Edisto recommendations that you see here a majority vote. A majority of the group agreed with it. I think in that handout I gave you, I told you how many fors and against there were. So you can kind of see, was most of them for it? And I think for this one, all but one was for this reasonable use language, I believe.
Yes.
Yes,
One
right,
abstained, one against, and 18.
right. So of the Broad, the PD, the Edisto, 65, 70 people, all but one liked this first recommendation, which was that the law should allow for reasonable use criteria be applied to all surface water withdrawals like they already exist for groundwater withdrawals. The Upper Savannah thought about that a little harder and said, well, they're not talking about necessarily new or existing. They said, we want that to apply to new surface water withdrawals. To be honest, when it was discussed in the Broad, the Edisto, and probably the PD, I wasn't part of that conversation. I don't think they were really differentiating between existing and new withdrawals. They were speaking more in general terms, kind of big picture, saying that, well, everybody should probably be subject to reasonable use criteria. I guess it depends on, whether you're rewriting the law or whether you're issuing new permits, how this recommendation applies. But regardless, pretty much everyone thought that there's no reason that reasonable use shouldn't be applied. And if it was applied, that would have eliminated the situation we see in the Edisto and parts of the PD. Conservation-minded folks wouldn't have been able to come in and ask for all that water. They could have asked for water, but it would have had to have been based on what they reasonably were expected to use. So, I don't want to get your thoughts on this yet because we're gonna do that in the next agenda item. I just want to show you what these recommendations were.
Would either of these recommendations address expiring permits becoming new, like we talked about, the great grandfather?
No, so think of this as just a bigger high level concept about reasonable use. And a lot of these recommendations don't get into the weeds as much. So we haven't really tried to solve every little problem. And you guys have already raised a lot of them here with some great questions about, how long the grandfather is. And when you redo it, if you want to make recommendations about that, you're welcome to. The other RBCs haven't got into that level of detail. They've generally talked about reasonableness and registrations versus permits. Should that be the case, or should it just be all permits? And should safe yield go away? Should MIF go away? Those type of big picture things. And with the limited time you have, I would encourage you to think about the big picture for now. And if you want to come back and you have recommendations that I think you all can get behind that are more specific, we can certainly entertain those. But for at least today, I'd like to keep it higher level. That's okay.
But I think that question comes out in the new or not new. That it kind of, because if you're grandfathered, then it's forever grandfathered, you never knew.
Yeah.
If you're only using 10% of your permit, there's no reasonable use. You get all of it.
So, but right now, reasonableness criteria applies to golf course, power, and water supply. It does not apply to ag or hydro. So this is saying that it would apply to all ag, basically, would be subject to reasonable use, where it is not now.
Right.
But only new.
But
Yeah, well,
only new,
which
right.
is what it is.
Which is what the Upper Savannah clarified. The other ones, they may have been thinking, well, yeah, it's obvious that we're talking about only new, but you could also think of the scenario, like if you're rewriting the regs, that permit could apply for everybody because you're rewriting and reissuing permits and registrations.
That's why I don't think that grandfathering process is separate from this. It's kind of.
You're right, it is part of that. And if you really want to be specific, kind of like the Upper Savannah, you'll make a recommendation that says new, or if you don't want to be specific, you won't. But
Is there any scenario where existing permits would be revisited? Like that they would be adjusted based on an updated regulation, or is that, I don't know. Taboo?
yeah, so
Start at the very beginning.
yeah, Leanne, and are you talking just about surface water or surface water and groundwater?
Well, I guess.
Okay, yeah, for groundwater, I think that's happened or could happen. Leanne, did you hear the question?
No, but I will say this for groundwater, all users and capacity use areas are permits. We don't really have the two programs are fairly different. So all groundwater users, whether you're ag, water supply, doesn't matter. They all have permits if you're in a capacity use area, which now contains all of the coastal plain counties. So if you're in the coastal plain and you're withdrawing greater than 3 million gallons in a month, you get a permit if it's groundwater. If you are pulling less than 3 million gallons a month in a capacity use area, you would get a registration. So registration means something different between groundwater and surface water. So I just want to put that out there first. So what was the actual question?
Is there a scenario where if regulations change, the surface water permits or registrations or whatever would be revisited? Or is
Sure,
it the
if
assumption
our
regs
change based on any law change, then we would have to bring all permits into compliance with the new law or regulation. I mean, it just depends on what the change is, right? But I think the idea would be if there is a change to the law and reg that requires changes to how our permitting is done, then we would revisit our permits.
So in those two scenarios, the top one would be water. It would revisit everything that exists.
Yeah, you could look at it that way.
Right.
When we were discussing it though, that really never came up. We were just thinking more in general terms. We weren't getting into details of, okay, if we issued a new law you know, should this apply? They were just saying, well, regional use should not be there, like groundwater. Dean?
Yeah, but on the lower one, coming from the upper Savannah, I'll just point out that in the upper Savannah Basin, given the reservoirs that are the basis for surface water supplies in that basin, water shortages are pretty hard to imagine. So the notion that existing surface water withdrawals ought to have some revisiting and a reasonable use criteria applied to their withdrawal. It's not surprising to me that their attitude is on, we don't want that. Other places in the state where there are not the enormous amount of water available every time we turn around, it seems to me, my suggestion would be that all surface water withdrawals ought to be able to demonstrate for a predictable period based upon growth rates, based upon their system. Let's just say it's 10 years. We can reasonably project a 10-year water demand for a municipality over time. That they ought to be looked at carefully every 10 years. And that their ability to withdraw should be based upon their need and their projected need, not upon the size of the pipe that happened to have been installed, you know, as the way of getting water out. I think that the growth rate in the state, and we're the fastest growing state in the country, and water resources are a critical portion of that process. And so we have got to start thinking, I think, as a state, how do we deal with this? You know, I worked in Arizona for 8 years in the city of Phoenix, trying to figure out how water supply was going to be made available. And right now, I don't even want to talk about what they're doing out there, but you can't just say you got as much water as you need because you happen to have this pipe that's, you know, can carry 1 million gallons a minute into your intake. I don't know. I'm pretty strong on the first one, on the one that the Broad PD and Edisto came up with. I think we should be looking at coming back and looking at all those surface water withdrawal permits and having them adjusted to acknowledge what their actual needs are and how predictable needs are.
Yep.
I have a question. I'm leaning that way too, but there was something that she said earlier that permitting costs more than registration. And why? Because if this analysis is what's causing that cost more, are you constraining small operators, small farmers, why is that a big cost difference? And is it actually supporting the big player, not the small player, if we do that? What's the reason? Why does it cost more?
Yeah, so the cost part really comes in when you're talking about registrations versus permits. And this thing, just the reasonable use determination, I don't think there's a lot of cost assigned to that. Basically, you're just
what is the cost assigned to? Because I think that if we said all the things that are going to be on the permit are now on a registration because all users have to go through the same.
So, I mean, there's a couple things. There's just the fee that you pay to the DES for a permit versus the registration.
Why? Why is the fee big?
Why is it different?
Yeah.
Yeah, Leanne, you want to say what the fees are and why they're different?
So to apply for a new surface water permit, it is $7,500. There is an annual fee for permits. It's $1,000 per intake annually. And that's every permit, whether you're existing or new. Every permit pays $1,000 a year on their intakes. And it's by intake. So if you have like 3 intakes, it's $3,000. Just registrations do not pay a fee. And I'll kind of I'm actually gonna go into a question in the chat asking why do we have separate permitting versus registration systems? So when the law was first being developed, the agricultural users were not considered at all. They did not want to be a part of it. They didn't want to be regulated. So it was just focused on permits for other users such as water supply, industrial users, those types of uses. So we only had permits. Then when we were getting close to the end of the process, from what I have learned is that, when we go through an assessment for a permit, we look at all upstream users. Well, if we don't know what farmers or ag users there are upstream, we can't consider them when doing a safe yield or minimum stream flow assessment. So their use is not accounted for. So that's when the ag users came in and said, well, we do want to be considered because we need to make sure that we have the water we need. And that's when the registration system came about for ag users. So that's why it's separate. As far as the fees go, that was just the fees that were developed during the process that the stakeholders agreed on. I don't know what the reason was for those specific numbers, but that's just what it is. Agricultural registrations do not have any fees. So to get a registration, there's no cost to the user. And that's why I was saying it would be cost prohibitive, because a lot of farmers, they'll go in to get a registration. It's free. And then if we were to tell them, well, now you have to get a permit, an application fee is $7,500. So that's going from zero to that.
And they have to pay the annual $1,000 fee.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So what would it be if they were to be if you were to add the reasonable use criteria to the registration instead of making them do a permit and just add the reasonable use criteria to the registration of an ag user? Could you not do that and continue to allow them to have a registration?
Yeah.
It's all on how, it's however, the law or whatever if something gets rewritten and that just gets added as a condition of a registration, that's not adding a fee to that. That's just adding that
I mean, it would
condition.
seem like you could do that for the ag and not put them in a permit situation and still put some kind of criteria so that at least you get a little bit more regulation on them and not necessarily.
I don't believe though the way that reads, it's only talking about permits, it's talking about an act.
Withdrawals.
That act, I assume, includes registrations and permits, correct or not?
Says withdrawals, which
Yeah.
includes.
Withdrawals.
and registration.
Here, we're talking about registrations though, because those are the ones where you don't have to demonstrate reasonable use.
Does that act though cover registrations and permits?
Yes.
So we're just saying that it's got to be reasonable use criteria applied to all those, whether it's a registration or permit, right?
Correct.
So it's not affecting anybody in the pocketbook, it's covering both.
Well, as it's worded, I can't tell that, but I think
Yeah.
I'd like to be
The whole
specific.
top of it, though, was an act. It's
I
just talking about an
understand that.
act, so that if the act talks about registrations and permits, and there's no cost for registration, they're just gonna have to allow for reasonable use criteria, there's no cost to them. They're just gonna have to-
Unless we're going to charge them for the cost of doing the analysis.
there is
So
no
there's not really a cost, I wouldn't think for them having to determine what the reasonable use is when they apply for registration. Leanne, what would that look like? They'd say, okay, I own 50 acres. I'm gonna irrigate it with a center pivot system. They give you that basic information to say, here's how much water I need.
Right. And so we would look at it a lot like how we look at it for groundwater. So groundwater users, once again, all groundwater users that have permits, which is all types of users, including ag, have to abide by reasonable use criteria. And for an ag user, that looks like just literally telling us how many acres they're irrigating, what types of crops they're irrigating, how many inches per week they estimate that they need for those crops. And then they tell us just information about their wells, like if they have, what kind of, what size pump they have and all that information. But, we use that information they give us to estimate, how much water is reasonable for their site. You know, they can put an estimate of how much water they want for their groundwater permit, but we do our calculations based on the information they supply in the application. And we also use guidelines from Clemson on reasonable irrigation amounts. So if you're irrigating corn, you need 2 inches a week, right? Like that's reasonable. For other crops, you might only need 1 inch a week. And then it depends on how many weeks a year they're planning to irrigate. And that's how we determine how much water somebody would need. So that's kind of how we do the reasonableness criteria for groundwater for a groundwater user already. So that process wouldn't change. That we would basically be doing that for surface water.
Do they pay for groundwater permits, ag?
No groundwater permits have fees. So whether you're a water supplier or an industrial user or an ag user, doesn't matter. No groundwater withdrawers. That the groundwater permitting program does not have fees.
The big picture outcome of this recommendation, if it was applied, would be so that the rest of the state, like the Edisto Basin and parts of the PD, doesn't get over allocated, basically, or the allocation amount doesn't reach, so then everybody has to, you know, it doesn't.
I like it. I just am worried that if it turns into fees, that it separates the big player from the small one. And that's what I like. I'm okay.
Okay.
One more question was, how big does a farm have to be before they use 3 million gallons a month?
Say that again, I'm sorry.
How big does a farm have to be before they use 3 million gallons a month?
Good question. Leanne, do you have an idea?
I would have to kind of look into it. It also depends on what crop they're irrigating. I can't remember off the top of my head. I'd have to do that calculation really quickly. A lot of times we will get an application, especially, you know, on the groundwater side, we'll map it out, and sometimes they don't need to get a permit because we'll tell them, look, like it looks like you're only going to be using this amount, you know, under 3 million. So we can start you out with the registration. And a lot of times the perk of having a registration for these smaller users is, you know, they still report their use to the department, and we can monitor their use. And if they start acquiring more property or irrigating more water heavy crops, and their use starts to creep up, we can then get back to them and say, hey, you actually need to apply for a permit, which still doesn't look that different from a registration from that perspective. But that means it needs to get renewed every 5 years and that sort of thing. They have a few other requirements to get a permit versus a registration on the groundwater side. But yeah, it's that same kind of thing with surface water. If they decide, you know, if they don't meet that threshold, we could still register them. But it really doesn't, on the surface water side, it's not really a big difference between meeting or not meeting that 3 million. If you don't meet the 3 million, you know, you're not necessarily meeting that. You don't need to meet a safe yield assessment. But yeah, I mean, I don't have that number in front of me for acreage.
Okay, I do want to take a quick break. It's 11:20 almost. We'll do a 10-minute break and start up again at 11:30, go for probably half hour until lunch. I want to walk through just the big picture recommendations. There's another 4 or 5 slides where there was some consensus from the RBCs, and then we're going to double back and start talking about, do we all like reasonable use? Do we want to say, yeah, we're pretty much behind it, and then we'll get into the other topics as well. But I want to kind of go through the whole list first, and then we'll come back and revisit these. I also want to say it's great to have Leanne back. She just got back from maternity leave on Monday, so she's a wealth of information. So welcome back, Leanne.
Thanks.
You can tell she's excited to be back. I'm sure Joe's excited to have her back. All right, we'll break until 11:30, and then we'll go through the rest of these. All right. So the next recommendation, where there was some consensus, at least in the Upper Savannah and the Broad, this recommendation as it wasn't really discussed earlier by the Edisto. And I wasn't the facilitator for the PD, so I don't know if it was discussed, but decided not to be selected, or Tom, I don't know if you remember if it came up or not, and they decided just to not adopt it. Regardless, it's more of a big picture recommendation. In fact, John and I were just talking about this. If you want to consider any of these recommendations as being the highest level, this is probably it. And it recognizes that the existing law and the regulations which came from the law grandfather so much of the water use that there's really no effective mechanism to manage it, right?
Right.
And there's little ways to enforce it. So while there's a system in place, because the fact that majority of the users are grandfathered, you can't really effectively manage it. There's nothing we can do. They don't have to abide by minimum stream flows. So they could, take advantage of the fact that they were granted a lot more water than they need and pull out as much water as they want and dry up the stream. And, that's a consequence we don't want to see. So the broad RBC actually came up with this, and the Upper Savannah agreed that, yeah, we like this as an overarching recommendation. Any thoughts or questions about this? And we're going to come back to this one again, but any initial thoughts? John?
I'll just chime in that I think you need the broad picture, the overarching, the umbrella, if you will, and then we work within the construct of the umbrella to build specific issues. To me, this comes pretty close to doing it.
Yeah.
And you might add a paragraph at some point that says why this is important.
Right. That's a good point. I didn't send you all example chapter 9s from the Edisto or Broad or even the PD now, which its draft is out. But when we present these recommendations in chapter 9, we usually have kind of the bold recommendation, and then there's some discussion underneath it, which is not bold. And in this case, I think in the Broad, and we haven't written the Upper Savannah one yet, but there's additional discussion which supports the recommendation. And we try to capture your thoughts as to why you're supporting this recommendation. You want it included in here. So keep that in mind, because we're going to have the recommendation, which is usually a sentence or two, and then why did you make this recommendation? Why is it needed? What does it solve? So that's how we'll present them in chapter 9.
Quick question. The word enforceable seems strange to me compared to the word manager. If we have management in the words down below, enforcement is a different meaning to me.
It is,
So
yeah.
why is enforcement in there? That's so they can be managed and effective or something. I think it's enforced means something else to me. So I don't know why. What does that mean?
Maybe enforcement is a management tool.
Yeah,
But there are lots of men.
right.
Yeah.
I agree with you. On second, reading of this, probably could have removed enforceable and just focused on effective management of the resource. And we need laws and regulations that allow for that. You don't need
Enforcement is part of the management.
Yeah. So that might be one way you tweak this recommendation.
On the other hand, when you're talking about laws, the term laws, they're either enforceable laws or they're not enforceable. That's a term that's specific to the concept of law. You enforce it, you don't enforce it.
Is effective part of it too?
Yeah.
I mean, I pick 60 words that are part of it.
I think at the point, and you're right, but for me, the key question here is if you're trying to manage your water resources, then you need some rules and you need to be able to enforce it. It's simple as that.
I agree with that, but I think if this is the big overarching one, is that where that's that word?
I would think so. The big overreaching one relating to the law, you would probably want to state your claim as the law being enforced. And then go on to all your management strategies. In the sentence. I would.
Yeah, you could even take the words ineffective out, and then it says effective below. They're not enforceable, then they can't be effective.
But it's a management problem. Yeah. Not an enforcement problem, is it?
Well, there's no enforcement.
Well, there's nothing to enforce.
There's no enforcement.
So effectiveness is really what we care.
Does it hurt though?
Yeah,
I said,
or even add management to that low part,
Yeah,
so that
this-
it's all there.
This discussion and this wordsmithing is what we'll have when we dive into this in a bit. First, I just want to show you the different categories because I think we're going to have limited time and I want to make sure we hone in on the ones where we think we can come to some consensus and we leave the other ones for discussion at the next meeting.
I've got a question. What is the penalty for withdrawing more water than your permit allows?
Leanne,
Yeah, I saw that and I've been trying to find the exact wording in here. In the reg. So
I read up to $10,000 a day.
Yeah,
so that's for right, so that's for yeah, so in the under enforcement, if you do where is it? Yeah, so if you commit a violation of the reg, there is a subject to a civil penalty of not more than $10,000. But this is what we usually do. And we kind of do this for ground and surface water users. If we see that they're using more than your permit or registration, we would typically get in touch with them and try to figure out what happened. And that kind of depends on, how much over. Like, are we talking 1 million over, or are we talking, greater than 50%? It kind of depends on how much over they've gone. But if you've gone over your permit, we would try to talk to you about it and figure out, what happened, and figure out a way to either reel that in, or they could apply for an increase if this would be a recurring issue. And I will say this: if someone that is considered an existing user applies for an increase to their permit, let's say their permit's for, I don't know, 10 million gallons a month, for example, and they apply to go from 10 to 12 million gallons a month, that 2 million gallon a month increase is subject to new permitting requirements. So that 2 million new additional is subject to minimum emission flow requirements and all those things. So I do want to mention that.
So even if they're a registered user and
Well, registered users are different once again. So if a registered user, and they're also, registrations are a little bit different. And I wanted to find, there's a specific wording in here that I wanted to find for registrations. So within, in the regulation, it mentions registration of agricultural withdrawers. And then one of the sections talks about regulatory authority, and it says that the department may modify the amount an existing registered surface water withdrawer may withdraw, or suspend or revoke a registered withdrawer's authority to withdraw water if the registered surface water withdrawer withdraws substantially more than what he is registered for, and the withdrawals result in detrimental effects to the environment or human health. So if a surface water registration withdraws both substantially more than they're registered for, and it results in detrimental effects, we can do something. But that's a very specific qualification, because you have to do substantially more, and that's not defined, and cause detrimental effects. And it would be very difficult for us to prove a detrimental effect to the environment or human health. So if I have a registration for, let's go with 10 again, 10 million gallons a month, and I withdraw 15 million gallons a month, well, is that substantially more than what I'm registered for? I mean, it depends on a case by case, like 10 to 15 versus if I have a registration for 50 and I do 55, that's not, I wouldn't call that substantial, but it's very, but then you also have to prove that it resulted in detrimental effects to the environment or human health. There's an and there, not an or. So it's very hard to do anything to registrations if they go above what they're registered for. But I'll say this, a registered user, a farmer, it costs them money to pump that water to irrigate and run their irrigation systems and all that. An irrigated user, an agricultural user is not using more water than they need, because if they need to use more, then that's costing them money. It can cause issues. Like, if they're not gonna overwater either. And because registrations don't have a reasonable use tied to it, they could have already registered for such a large amount of water that they're unlikely to go over what they've gotten a registration for in the first place. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Brian's got to speak.
Yeah, Brian, you had a comment?
Yeah, I guess, an overarching question related to all these, particularly as it applies to the lower Savannah Basin. If what I'm hearing, it sounds like a lot of the grandfathered permits are most likely overstated based on what their usage would be. What happens to that basically unallocated water in the river? Does this, could it be transferred to Georgia? Is there some larger consequence to this potentially?
I don't know, Leanne, if you can address that, but I guess one question, part of that is when you're looking at the Savannah safe yield, if you've even looked at that, you're accounting for Georgia withdrawals in that calculation, right?
Well, we do when we're doing so if we a lot of times we'll use the model, we'll plug it in there, and I know that they're listed in there, like whatever we have. But a lot of times, I guess I'll use something in another basin, for example. Like if I'm doing one in the PD, and I know the PD originates in North Carolina, I don't have their withdrawals. However, if I'm doing a safe yield calculation, I'm using data from USGS monitoring gauge stations for getting an estimate of how much water is flowing through the intake location, or get an approximation for there. Withdrawals and discharges are inherent in that data because, whatever's been withdrawn or discharged, that's now whatever's left is flowing by that gauge station, if that makes sense. So in a way we are accounting for it, but I'm not, I don't have every single Georgia intake or North Carolina intake for me to do my assessment. I can throw it into the model and get and do it that way. And that's a big part of our assessment. We do use SWAM, but when I'm going through a general safe yield, I don't have, their permit limits or anything else specifically, but they are included they're inherent in the with the flow data in a USGS monitoring gauge.
Okay.
But whatever water is, can be taken, we're not, we manage it differently. So I couldn't say like, okay, I know there's X amount of water left that Georgia is taking. We don't really look at it that way, I guess.
Yeah, Dean.
This is just a recommendation for us to consider as we go forward. It would seem to me that it would be reasonable for us to recommend that as a policy, that DES develop a active and formal relationship with adjacent states whom we share water resources with. In North Carolina, Georgia specifically, so that the information that she would need to make those types of judgments is available, that the states are actually working together to decide exactly what's happening, where it's happening, who's storing what, who's discharging what, so that our records reflect what is really happening and what North Carolina is doing. And the same thing with Georgia on the other side. It seems to me that could be a recommendation that came out of this organization.
I
add something, John?
Yeah.
When we're in the PD, ag is different in North Carolina. It's under different laws and they can't release that data as far as I understand.
Yeah, they keep pretty tight on their water use data for ag in North Carolina, but so there has been some collaboration with Georgia and North Carolina and sharing data. In fact, we've reached out to Georgia and North Carolina to help build the models. So we had to get information from them to the extent that we could. DES may do additional collaboration with them, but that's a good recognition to consider. So let's keep that in our back pocket and we bring that up when we get into actually writing our recommendations. We'll see if we can get consensus behind it. Tom, is there other online comments or no?
No.
Okay. Okay, so again, that's a big picture one. There's another one that's been proposed, and it was the Broad approved it by consensus, and the Edisto, I think this one was by majority, but barely. I think it was maybe I'm thinking of another one. This has to do with distinguishing between registrations and permits. Let's see.
Yeah. And I wouldn't want to use that. And I wouldn't say anything like that. But I can.
Oh, it's the same rules here. So the Edisto had one that said all water withdrawals should be subject to the same rules. That's basically saying the same thing as this one. Don't distinguish between registrations and permits. Everybody should just be permits. And they voted 13. No. Oh, no, I'm sorry, 9, 4, and 8 against. So there was a lot of discussion in the Edisto about yes and no. And a lot of folks felt like, no, agriculture is unique. You need a unique system for it. But the Broad, there's very little agricultural use. We didn't have a lot of agricultural representation on the board. We did when we started, and by the time we got to the recommendations, they'd kind of dropped off. There was some forestry representatives there, but they all generally agreed that there shouldn't be a difference. So there's been a lot of discussion on this in all the RBCs, and at least the Broad is the only one so far that said, we feel there shouldn't be a difference. The Edisto by simple majority did, but it was a very small majority. Okay, the next couple ones get a little away from the law and regulation and talk more about funding. Again, I'm talking about similar recommendations where there's commonalities amongst the other RBCs. The Upper Savannah and the PD said that they felt the legislature should also authorize recurring funding for state water planning activities, including river basin planning. So basically, they're saying there needs to be a process to fund this ongoing planning activity from the legislature. The Upper Savannah and the PD also said that there needs to be a way to implement the actions and strategies that you all identify in your river basin plan. And one way to do that is by, setting up some type of seed grant program. And we actually heard in the Upper Savannah from Georgia and Georgia EPD staff about the seed grant program that was established to do just that with their regional water councils. They give out a small number, it's like 4 or 5, 6 or 7 grants that are kind of matching grants to municipalities primarily, local governments to implement actions that were identified in their regional water plans. So at least there's a mechanism there to fund some of these things. Right now, there's nothing specifically in place in South Carolina that will allow that. So Upper Savannah and PD felt that was important, and they developed a recommendation around that. Okay, the other one, the Broad had a recommendation that said water withdrawal permitting process should specifically assess the permit application's alignment with the current river basin plan, particularly regarding withdrawals, returns, resource conservation, and drought response. So what they were suggesting and what the discussion centered around was that what DES does to review a permit or registration application, and here I guess they were talking about permits, is great, but they should also look at the river basin plans that you all are preparing, see if that withdrawal is consistent with what you have put into your plan, whether it be best management practices or policies or recommendations or the results of the basin-wide modeling looking current and 50 years into the future. They just felt it was important that the plan be considered during the permitting process. They weren't specific about what aspects should be considered, but They wanted the river basin plan to be one aspect of that permitting process. The PD had a slightly different, but I interpreted to be kind of a similar recommendation that said water supply information should be considered when evaluating the feasibility of new industries. You know, Tom, any of the specific discussions centered around that?
That might have been a long time ago when we were waiting for the groundwater model. I don't really recall.
Yeah, I don't think I was at that meeting. I interpreted that as kind of being similar to what the Broad came up with, but it could be interpreted different ways. It's kind of a very broad recommendation.
There is a comment.
Question.
Yeah.
An
Go ahead.
example, maybe that you can tell us is the car manufacturing facility, which is being built north of Columbia, along the road to Charlotte. A monster, a huge automotive construction facility. Do we know what the water supply is for that?
Is that the Catawba?
No.
I think it's in the lower part of the Broad. This is the Scout Motors facility, I think.
Manufacturing facility.
Yeah. Leanne, you know, where they're getting their water? Is it from Blytheville or what? Yeah, or Columbia ultimately, or?
Are you talking about it's in like the Blythewood that area?
Yeah.
I'm not 100% sure. I feel like they're probably getting it from the city or county, but I'd have to look into that.
I don't know.
Monster. The demand has got to be enormous.
Is this the Scout Motors?
Yes.
That's what I was asking. Yeah, I was
Yeah.
kind of I figured
I-
that's what they were talking about.
I assume they haven't applied for a permit or else you would have seen it, right?
Yeah, if they don't have a surface water permit application in house, I don't know that there was a groundwater application, and if it's in what county is that? Is it like northern?
It's in Richland County.
Richland County. But it might be on the other side of the fall line, so there may not be enough groundwater, like sufficient groundwater for them to get a well. So they're probably getting it from the city or county.
That's a perfect. That was somehow.
It's adjacent to Blythewood.
Yeah, the availability of reasonable water supply ought to be determined first. Before you permit the place to start, you know, is there gonna be enough water? And that, to me, is something that we could. And I think that bottom one works for that. You know,
Well, if they,
feasibility of new information, do we have?
if they have already, I'm sure that they already had the discussions with the local officials, the city or county or whoever, economic development, to make sure that all of that was available long before they started building it. So I'm sure that was already.
Well, yeah, so that's come up in other RBCs and I
Yeah, they
asked that.
do.
and
That's,
people-
that happens all the time before it starts building. They already have that discussion. We have that discussion all the time before any of that happens. So
It's like all the
if we are gonna provide them water and sewer and that kind of thing, that's gonna happen way before they're discussed their building.
I'm not sure it does.
But you might agree to provide additional supply.
Appeals and all those decisions that are happening right now, we talk about it all the time.
I just shut down the chicken plant. When the county said.
Oh, yeah, sometime. Okay, we'll do the online question.
All right. This is a three-part comment. At what point is a farm large enough to be considered an industry? Perhaps the registration system should only apply to smaller farms. Power plants are classified as major generator or smaller generators. Major facilities have to address more regulations, spend more to get licensed. Perhaps the registration process could be set up in a similar manner. And Will added where Scout Motors is and the building is under construction.
Yeah, okay. Well, the first part of that, at what point does an agricultural operation get so big it's considered an industry? I think that still has to do with, are they using the water for irrigation?
Correct. So
Right.
it's how we define an agricultural facility or agricultural use. The regulation and I believe the statute, they define agricultural use and agricultural facilities. So we can't, it doesn't matter how big it is or small it is. We have a definition of what ag use is, and that's what registrations are for, is anything that's under those definitions of agricultural use or an agricultural facility.
So if
But
a company like Cargill came in and built some huge farm and, and they obviously have deep pockets and could pay for permitting and all that, they would still only have to register.
they would get a if they're using surface water, they get a registration. I do have the number of acres. So if you're irrigating something about an inch a week, which is pretty standard, you would have to have a 30-acre farm. Now, if you're doing a high water use crop like corn, if you're doing 2 inches a week, it's about half that, right? Like 14 to 15 acres. But the typical threshold is about a 30-acre farm would require a registration, or would reach that 3 million threshold for permitting or registration.
So if somebody's got a couple of 100 acres or 500-acre farm, then they're using a boatload of water is what it sounds like.
Yes, and you would get a registration if you're using surface water. Now, a lot of farms also have wells, and they get permits for those. And some that do have surface water, a lot of times do have wells as backup. For those drier times, like a lot of even if a registration has a very large number attached to it, you got to remember that that intake isn't like a drain in the bottom of the river. If the flow goes below that intake, they're not going to move it to continue to try to withdraw from there. They're going to move to other sources or stop irrigating completely. So they're probably going to go to wells or some other source. But if it's dry enough, it's not going to be coming from that intake.
Well, my point was that, earlier we talked about the $7,500 fee and $1,000 a year per intake being, a cumbersome amount for, and for a 30-acre farm. Yeah, it would be a cumbersome amount, but not for some large corporation. And so I guess that's where I was going, is that maybe in the power generation industry, you have above 75 megawatts is a major generating facility, and they have to go through a lot more hoops, and it costs a lot more money than if you're going to produce less than that. And seems like maybe the registration system, that might be a way to modify the registration system to keep the fairness, but at the same time, kind of lock down some of these problems.
Yeah, that's a good thought. Okay. Any other online chat? Okay. We're right at lunch. Let me just see how many more. I only had 2 more topics, and then we're going to revisit these, but let me go through these and then we'll do lunch. Here's to just other notable recommendations. Now, there necessarily wasn't commonality between different RBCs, but I wanted to mention them. The Edisto spent a good amount of time talking about some specific details with regard to the safe yield definition, specifically around whether it should be based on 80% of median instead of mean annual daily flow. Jason Thompson of Charleston Water System had a great statistical presentation that demonstrated why using mean is not a very good approach, but using median is a much better approach. And it's because high flows really skew the median away from the mean. So that was a discussion that got very detailed. We haven't had that detailed discussion in any other RBC. It was something Jason was pretty compassionate about, but I just want to bring it up here that it did merit a lot of discussion, at least in the Edisto. The PD had an interesting recommendation, which I included here, that said a cost share program should be developed to drill deeper wells into aquifer units with less development pressure. Keep that one in mind, because when we hear back from Brooke, we may decide that, okay, we've got some areas where the shallow aquifers are under more pressure, and we want to encourage deeper groundwater withdrawals. And if you want to encourage that, one way to do that is to have some type of cost share program or something. So keep that one in the back of your mind. The Saluda has been discussing recommendations for 5 or 6 meetings now. They're really diving into them. They spent a lot of time on technical recommendations and planning process, and they're just now getting into policy, regulatory, legislative recommendations. These three recommendations here were offered up from Melanie Ruhlman of Save Our Saluda. So she represents kind of the conservation water interest category in the Saluda. And she's put a lot of thought into this, and her recommendation is to apply all three of these. They all go together. Basically, the first one, she's saying that, you should require permits for everybody, including those before 2011 and all registered users. And they all should be evaluated for reasonableness and meet in-stream flow requirements. So kind of gets rid of the grandfather thing and makes everybody under a level playing field. That's what she's suggesting. She's saying remove the safe yield metric entirely from the law and implementing regulations, get rid of that concept, and then revise the minimum stream flow standards based on the best available science to adequately protect designated uses. Didn't mention it, but we've talked about it in previous meetings when we presented modeling results. Those minimum stream flow standards are based on 20, 30, or 40% of the mean annual daily flow, depending on which month you're looking at. And that 20, 30, or 40% was all based on in-stream flow policy that DNR developed back when, I can't remember, Scott, but you may remember. And there was science behind it, but Melanie's point is that there's new, better available data. We've talked about some of that already, like the ecological flow relationship work that we've looked at with Luke Bauer and Brandon Peoples. That's kind of a similar but different approach, but it leverages all the fish data and macrophyte data, that macroinvertebrate data that DNR and DHAC or DES have been collecting. So anyway, that was her recommendation. It's been discussed in the Saluda. It's probably not going to pass by consensus because there's folks that are opposed to one or more parts of that. I can't say whether there's going to be a majority vote on this and we'll adopt parts of it or not, but it's been considered, and I just wanted to offer it up because it's an RBC member that's taken the time to say, here's what they think the ideal approach would be. So just for your consideration. Okay, with that, we're going to break, we're going to do lunch, and then we're going to come back and we're going to probably start with the easy one, reasonable use, and then figure out where else we might find consensus. It's 12:05. Let's take 20 minutes. So 12:25 online folks will probably start the discussion back up again. We're finishing our lunch right around 12:25.
Got a lunch sign sheet over here as well.
Okay. So at this point in the agenda, actually, I had noted we were going to start talking about water management strategies. But what I'd prefer to do is keep the discussion going, and we'll probably end up using the rest of the remaining time to dive further into some potential recommendations. I want to see if we can reach consensus on any of the bigger picture recommendations, so we can again report to Water SC bigger picture, all of the RBCs basically. So I'm fine if we move, as long as you guys are, if we move the discussion of water management strategies to the next meeting. I was hesitant to start on it anyway, because we haven't heard from groundwater yet, and we will definitely be considering some water management strategies that are groundwater related. So if you're okay, we're going to keep going on recommendations, and we may just bump that agenda item. Everybody comfortable with that? I'm good with that here.
So
Okay.
the only thing is with the ag representation not being here.
Yeah, so I'll talk about how we're going to address that.
Okay.
So we've got a couple of topics that I'm thinking we can discuss, and they're based on some of the commonalities of recommendations that have been developed by the other RBCs. The first one's reasonable use. I would really like to talk about that one and see if we can come to some consensus. The next one is the idea of grandfathered versus new users, which gets to that kind of overarching topic of, hey, we can't, right now, we can't use the law, the act to effectively manage the system or to even manage it at all. So what needs to be done to address that? There's the topic of whether all users should be treated the same. So everybody's required to get a permit, or you should have distinctions by water use type or by the amount of water you're using, for example. And then maybe we can talk a little bit about funding potentially and or alignment with river basin plans and any other topics. But I'd like to get through some of those at least. What we've been doing in some of the other RBCs so that we don't spend too much time talking about any one recommendation is using kind of a stoplight approach or a bucket approach, where we put recommendations in a green, yellow, or red bucket. And this has helped us when we've spent too much time talking about a recommendation and people want to think about it a little more, they need more information. We put it into a yellow bucket and we revisit it the next meeting, and give people homework. All right, think more about this, how you want to wordsmith it, whether you can live with it or not, and we're going to try to finalize it at the next meeting. If we see consensus and everybody likes a recommendation, it'll go right into the green bucket and we'll move on. If it's obvious we're not going to come to consensus, and if you decide that you want to have your recommendations only by consensus, then we might put something in a red bucket and just drop that recommendation altogether and move on. So one distinction again, is I mentioned this with regard to the Edisto and everybody else. Everybody else so far has pretty much said, we only want to put recommendations in our plan where there's complete consensus amongst council members. The Edisto, especially specifically for the policy, regulatory, and legislative recommendations, it was clear they weren't coming to consensus. So we documented how many were for it, how many were against it, and why they were for it and why they were against it. So we kind of painted the complete picture. And we thought that was useful for to inform the state water plan later on. Why was there support for it? What are the issues with it? That type of thing. So for some recommendations, we went by majority. The Saluda has adopted that approach. Generally, they've already approved most of their recommendations by consensus, but there's already been one or two that they've not had consensus on, almost consensus, but there was a few folks that didn't agree with it and they didn't vote for it, but they decided, yeah, let's go ahead and document it, and it'll note next to the recommendation, this one was by majority, but not by consensus. So a question to you all is, how do you want to do your recommendation? Do you think it's important to have complete consensus, and you don't want to mention or consider recommendations in the plan that don't, or do you want to include some where there's a majority and note those as having a majority but not consensus? How do you feel about that? Which approach do you think you want to take?
I think you have to go with majority, or otherwise you won't have any, you may not have consensus on some important topics.
I think consensus would be preferred.
Right.
Preferred, yeah, people are passionate.
Right. So the broad RBC said the same thing. Consensus is preferred. In fact, if we can't come to consensus, we don't even want to note what those recommendations were. We're all about consensus. Even if one person votes against it, that's not consensus, and we're not going to include that in the plan. But the Saluda and the Edisto said, no, we still want to note which ones had a majority. And in the Edisto's case, how much of a majority or how little of a majority, and document those in the plan. So that's the question. And we can address that when we come to each individual recommendation. If we can't get
It depends on whether we reach consensus or not.
right, and that's what the Saluda is doing. They're pretty much reaching consensus on everything, but we debated and debated some, and we couldn't get a couple of members to live with. Remember, you're going based on what you can live with. You might not be 100% behind a recommendation, but for the good of the group, you can live with it.
Live with it.
That's kind of live with it, right?
I can accept it.
Right. And when you go to vote on the draft plan, remember, you're going to vote on a 1 to 5 system, all the chapters and everything together, which includes the recommendations. And if you kind of said, well, I can live with 5 or 6 of these, I'll go ahead and go with the consensus, or vote yes so we can have a consensus. But when you go to vote on the draft plan, you might give it a 2 instead of a 1, because you're supporting the plan, but there's a few things that if it was just up to you, you might have done a little different. So that's why you'd vote a 2 when we go to vote on the whole draft plan.
Doug, is your experience so far, are agreements or disagreements a function of the kind of variety of water use in the basin? In other words, if we go farther north and we're dealing with surface water, seems to me that the uses are different than they are here, or that they would be in the Edison. I mean, we're mostly a flatland agricultural
we've got ag, we've got urban, we've got industry. Not so much ag, way up and further north, depending on the water. Has there been kind of a tendency to explain those differences in the way people pursued it based upon the complexity of the water use in the basin?
Well, definitely in Yellowstone, there was ag contingent and then others, conservation, public supply. Ag typically voted one way on some issues, but not always. There was always some back and forth even between the ag folks, whether they supported something or not. That's about the only instance I can think of where there's a definite distinction between water use. It's how folks were voting. Generally, it's been consensus.
I was gonna say, part of it really came down to anything with regulatory potential. Man, and that's just fact of it, really.
Yeah.
You've got some folks that are heavily regulated, and when you present some of these items to a leadership position, they're never going to vote for any more potential regulation.
There's also been acknowledgement from some of the agriculture community that they like the status quo, even though they're behind some of the recommendations and ideas that are proposed. They're hesitant to vote for it because it could open up the regs to changes. And they don't want to vote for anything that would suggest, hey, let's revisit the law. And I understand that. And that's, I mean, a reason why they decided, no, we don't really want to vote for anything because it might suggest opening up the law. And we think the status quo is good.
There's a comment from Jeff.
Yeah, Jeff.
I think the approach of adopting the majority recommendations and explaining the two positions in the plan allows us to have a greater impact than if we restrict ourselves to only recommendations that have consensus.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think I see heads nodding to agree with it. So what we'll do is as we get to recommendations, if we don't have consensus, we'll see if it's a majority. And if y'all want to go ahead and include and document that as a majority, we can. So we'll treat it on a case-by-case basis, what you were suggesting here.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we got our green, yellow, red bucket approach. What we're actually going to do for most of these is, well, if we, amongst our group here and who's on the line, if we can agree to it, we'll probably put it in a yellow bucket, or I'll put it both green and yellow, that we had consensus. But because the ag folks aren't representing us here, I want to make sure we're getting their approval. So we'll have to revisit this at another meeting when they're present, or I'll have to send it to them and get them to review and comment on it. So we won't finalize these, even if we come to some consensus on them, until later. Okay, so starting with one, I think, well, the one that has the most consensus amongst RVCs was the idea of reasonable use. And again, we talked about Upper Savannah, specifically wanted to mention new. Everybody else kind of just like the broad definition because we didn't really get into distinction. But how do you all feel about this recommendation? One or the other? Do you agree with it? Do you think there should be some modifications to it before you would want to agree to it and propose it and vote on it? Who wants to start the discussion on this one?
I'll start the discussion. I'm in favor of the one on top. The one that's supported by the broad PD and pedestal. I believe we need to have reasonable use criteria. So it's the water, we don't have an unlimited water supply. Most of our, particularly for the Savannah-Salkehatchie. So we do not have an unlimited supply. So we have to base how much water people are going to be permitted to use or authorized to use based on some reasonable criteria.
Comment.
Yeah.
Can we agree in concept now, but wordsmith later?
Yeah, that's fine too. That will still allow me to kind of present an overview to Water SC that you agreed in concept to this. The wording is still yet to be figured out. So that's fine. And in fact,
I'm in
after we,
agreement.
go ahead.
I'm in agreement.
Agreement team,
Top.
yeah,
Top.
yeah. Is anybody, opposed to this recommendation about using reasonable use criteria for surface water, like it already exists for groundwater?
Top.
The top one. I mean, either one, but I'm just thinking about reasonable use in general, regardless of whether it's all or just new. Yeah, everybody agrees with it? Yeah,
All includes new.
yeah, all does include new, so
I think we all like the top.
do you all like the top one?
All
Yeah.
there.
Okay, everybody in the room likes the top one. What about you online, folks? Are you all comfortable with the top recommendation, the broad PD and Edisto? All liked, except for one in the Edisto?
Jeff said top, thumbs up from Brian.
Yep.
Okay from Mary. Taylor, thumbs up.
Okay. All right.
See any objection?
How about that? We green bucketed one already. So put my green bucket over here. We're good with reasonable use. Right? Good. All right. Or Croza. Okay, the next one is that more big picture one that the Upper Savannah and Broad developed. I've heard some suggestions for wordsmithing this one, which we can consider now. Before we wordsmith it, is there anyone that doesn't like this suggestion or this recommendation? Forget the enforceable part, just the concept of you won't have grandfathered users and then all new users, which are under a different system, which results in the ability not to effectively manage the resource.
The only thing I don't like about it is it doesn't actually say you're eliminating the grandfather.
No, yeah, and so the discussion in the Broad was that they weren't ready to go there, but they just wanted to at least acknowledge that that the current law needed improvement. So,
But the whole thing targets all about the grandfather. That's the whole purpose of that. If you read that.
yeah, right,
That the opposite word.
right.
It's suggesting that it needs to be revisited. That's what it's doing. It's not saying eliminate, but the previous one you just passed didn't pretty much eliminate grandfather.
No, the reasonable use one doesn't eliminate grandfathering. It just requires that reasonable use criteria be used for surface water withdrawals, but it doesn't contemplate the grandfathering issue.
If you don't have reasonable use.
Yeah,
You lost your
To me, it
grandfather.
does.
So it does eliminate pieces of it, unless you're within your reasonable use, then you're.
You have 100 million gallons a day, you're taking 10.
You've eliminated.
And then you've eliminated 9 venture. Nothing more than just approved. It was reasonable use.
Likely to.
If we had a definition section at the beginning, which you should, when you're defining your terms, you're using, then we would effectively define reasonable use. We would effectively define all the terms we're using. So by the time we get to these two statements, we're eliminating grandfather.
Yeah, so the act itself, the law does have a definition section up front, so we'll probably reference that. I don't have that here on me. If we have specific questions, Leanne can bring it up, but
Well, and but we should too, we should also, clarify the terms and our intent in these sections. At some point, whether it's before or after. I mean, we need to.
I think we're getting
refine.
But I think that if we go back up, does the law need to be improved? That's what.
Yeah.
Does anybody disagree with that?
No.
That's the law. I think it's one of the reasons we're here. That's kind of needs to be improved to support effective management.
Yeah.
That's the whole purpose of that is grandfather. That's, we read that, it's all about grandfather. Otherwise, the paragraph sucks. If you just said it needs to be improved, then what does that mean? The whole operative is about.
We can walk down to grandfather, I agree, but it doesn't need to be improved. Is there? I think that if we can say, if we all agree it needs to be improved, of course, then yeah.
Because there's other things we talked about, like the measurement.
Right.
That doesn't have anything to do with grandfathering.
Right.
And the need to maybe improve that.
When the broad proposed this recommendation, most of the discussion was around the fact that there's grandfathered folks, which don't really have any regulation. They've already been given all the water they probably need for a long time, and then new people that are subject to regulation. That was the majority of the discussion, but they purposely crafted the language there that says laws and regulations need to be improved to keep it general. So they wanted to kind of be an umbrella to cover a lot of things. Grandfathering was the biggest one because they thought that's where the biggest flaw is, that 94% of the folks can do whatever they
That's exactly how I
want.
read it.
Yeah.
Just- It needs to be improved,
Mhm.
and grandfathering is a major issue, so it's mixed.
Right,
But
right,
there are lots of other things to make it more effective or whatever.
Right.
Whatever.
right. But they didn't decide to even get into all those other little things. They only had 4 or 5 policy, regulatory, and legislative recommendations, and they were pretty big picture ones.
I like this because I think of it as that bottom piece more important than the top piece. So the law needs to be.
Yeah, so you were asking, is there consensus amongst the bold part? Do folks agree the law needs to be improved, or does anybody think the status quo is okay?
I think it needs to be improved.
I think it needs to be improved. Okay,
As far as how, that's, later.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like
You may wordsmith some of it.
this works for now.
yeah,
But as we go on, we can define and clarify. So like in a legal setting, I'm a paralegal, in my world, we would cast a big net, and then as we go forward, at the very beginning, we cast a big net. Do a broad statement, and then as you go forward, you pull it down, and you funnel down what you actually want. You say more, you say more, you say more. In the beginning, you don't have to do all. You don't have to make the job harder. We start with big and work from here.
Yeah.
And really, the previous recommendation is an improvement
Yeah.
upon the law.
Exactly. This one's first, not second.
Right.
You'd almost make this the first one, premier
Right.
statement that drives everything.
Yeah.
John, there was a comment. Improve the current laws to allow regulation of water use to be more effective for water management, move grandfather to a separate recommendation.
I was gonna say this, but
I think that's.
oops.
Most of us.
Read that again, Tom.
Read that again.
Yeah, sure. Improve the current laws to allow regulation of water use to be more effective for water management.
Be more effective for water management.
I've been trying to get those little maps the whole time.
Yeah.
Move grandfather to a separate recommendation.
Keep track.
Yeah, I don't know if South Carolina law is written this way or not. Federal law frequently has a statute. And then there's attached to it what they call a conference report. The conference report has that kind of unbolded wording in it. The statute has what we're talking about in bold. But the two are connected so that it can be interpreted for regulations going forward, because that's where the rubber really meets the road.
Yeah.
You're not going to send everybody to jail. You're trying to govern their behavior.
Yeah.
And show what's appropriate so they don't run afoul.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to do here, I think. when
Okay.
we document these in chapter 9.
Okay.
That approach, I guess. Yeah. Okay, well,
I think the main issue we hit on today for hours was grandfathering was the thing that necessarily conflict. And you have a new user, the grandfathers take all the allocation, you know, they're out using it, that new user may not be able to water in the ground.
yeah,
So that doesn't, the process doesn't make sense mostly because of grandfather. There's other issues, but.
yeah.
Everybody agrees that's the big thing.
Yeah. So
Well,
you
so
wanna-
yield's an issue. I mean, there's
some think administering flow is an issue, yield's an issue. Cost of permits or registrations is an issue. There's just different subtleties that we won't talk about. And
But how much of some of those things are a result of inadequate measuring or not knowing what the totals are because we permitted or we have users that have allotted so much when they're only using this much, or I mean, what are symptoms and what are the symptoms?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know that we know. I don't know that we know the error in the reporting and whether that's an issue or not. That may be.
Figure it out with the current system.
That may be a recommendation you want to make, is to better study whether the existing reporting mechanism is adequately characterizing water use. Should there be improvements? Should there be things like Florida required meters to be calibrated every year or so, you know, and I don't think that's part of what Leanne was suggesting. Certain users have to have meters, but they don't necessarily have to calibrate them and show those records to say, yeah, I'm accurately measuring my flow. So that gets into more specific details, which we can dive into later. I don't necessarily want to do that today. I want to focus on the big picture stuff. Okay, so we had a recommendation or a suggestion from, I don't know, online, but of just changing the first part to say improves the current water laws and allow regulation of water use to be more effective for water management. That could mean grandfathering and a lot of other things, but that itself could be a standalone recommendation, and we can fill in some specifics under that later.
Can we take what was on the last slide? Did that go under that? I know it's kind of.
This reasonable use one?
I mean, I know it's kind of duplicative, but.
I think it's within, I think one is an umbrella and this one's this, I think that's the first, it should be our top recommendation.
Yeah, that one should be the top, and then the report from the previous slide needs to go under.
Yeah, we can write it up that way.
I
Yeah.
think that's how.
Yep. In fact, I'll just put a note here. This is top.
I think the political reality being is that if grandfathering is not politically manageable, it's going to be very hard to manage the water resources in the state.
No,
Right?
the one that says enforceable should be the top one. And then the
Well,
part of page one should go there.
we're just ignoring the top bullet there because somebody suggested some other language, but let me come back to that in a second. What were you saying, Ken?
I mean, it just seemed to me that's the elephant in the room. The other things, you know, that we talked about can be managed, tweaked, and permit fees and all that stuff, but the process of grandfathering, which is a result of a political compromise, still exists in the future, then it's going to be nearly impossible to manage the process.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the reality. So, and I think that's why they phrase it that way.
Right.
And if we just make it so generic, like the one below, is we use it. It's just a generic statement that everybody.
But I think the other ones have to come below this. This is just generic, but then you have another one saying attacking grandfathering. And then another one's attacking, you know, another topic. So I think they're all within this. Grandfathering should be the first one. I agree with you, absolutely. And maybe it's just redefining what grandfathering means. It's not really exempt. You still can be grandfathered with these new requirements. So it's.
I suggest we basically move forward with the understanding that John has that we're gonna organize these so they make sense as
Right. So that's what I was getting at. I kind of like the suggestion of organizing them under this one. I think we should just talk about grandfathering next. Like, does everybody agree with that? You know, do we want to have that as a recommendation underneath that bigger picture one? So let's pursue it that way. How we present it in chapter 9, we can finalize later, but we'll take this approach for now.
I also feel like we lose punishment when we remove the enforceable. Because that. And we already had a full discussion on this earlier, so I don't want to rehash it. I feel like enforceable was pivotal to that. First. Yeah.
Yeah.
we could say regulation of water use to be enforceable and more effective in water management.
So, yes, something.
Just add a word or two in that top.
Okay, well, so I was hearing some different things earlier on. You were kind of against using it enforceable.
Effective first. If it's effective and it's a law, you should be able to enforce it. And so, so I think effective first, let's make it effective law.
Mhm.
And then enforcement comes second. So I think I'm okay with enforcement as part of it, but I think
Yeah.
every law should be enforceable.
Yeah,
Maybe a effective regulation.
Well, we heard they're not though.
We can have a whole conversation about laws that aren't
No, no,
enforced.
right now,
But
we heard from staff. that they're not enforcing. It's too hard to interpret to enforce, even though there's fine, but is it hurting the environment? Is it
That's
too much water?
That's a very
yeah,
specific.
we did your specific example.
You can't enforce it.
I think effective first.
Why have a law if you can't enforce it?
Mhm.
I agree with you.
Yeah,
Let's not use the word enforcement.
Yeah, I prefer the top.
you prefer the top one?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
We can dissect it for 3 hours.
It has me, logically, right?
Can you live with the top one with enforceable in there, Bill?
The effective and enforceable, maybe. It's not, like, it has to be effective first. It has to be effective first. Not just when we say that, we're saying enforce, you know, I think that's like
There's more power to adopt something that's been done by other river basins and saying we want to support that. And then talking about to go to the, you know, it just gets.
Yeah,
I was answering his question.
okay. So the first bullet, everybody good with how that's reworded now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. And you, a recommendation underneath that then can be the grandfathering part, right? Now, we're not making a recommendation there. That's just a statement. You want to make a recommendation that's supported by that statement that says there should be no distinction between existing users and new users. They should all be treated the same. And when you're saying that, you're basically saying DES needs to go out and re-permit everybody.
I'm not sure I agree with that. I like what we said in the slide previously. We've essentially eliminated the most important part of grandfathering by reasonable use. We've already said that as a separate recommendation. You can say that again in another way. I don't think I think politically you're going to get in trouble by saying eliminate grandfather. I think you're opening up the can of worms.
Or there might be other reasons to distinguish between new and existing, so I would be hesitant to just say. Doesn't matter whether you're new or existing, there might be, a need to distinguish, not necessarily to eliminate reasonable use. But I agree that reasonable use should take care of the grandfathering concern.
With our biggest consensus there.
Right, so that there is a distinction between like existing users don't have to have a contingency plan in place and they don't have to abide by minimum stream flows. That has nothing to do with reasonable use.
Right.
So that's why you gotta think about the other parts of that. Reasonable use doesn't cover that. So that recommendation doesn't get rid of that distinction.
Right.
But you may be able to address those without grandfathering.
Right.
To your point, like, there may be smaller tactics to address those issues. That could be more quickly.
That's what I'm thinking is don't poke it in the eye. Boil this frog, don't go
That first.
Maybe the recommendation is to have a plan developed that would move all the grandfathered users into the current system over some period of time. Maybe that would be the recommendation.
That's a technique.
Yeah, I mean, that's a way to get there.
We're not rewriting the law.
Yeah, we're not rewriting the law. At the same time,
Write a paragraph.
yeah, at the same time, I mean, DHEX and DS's, they had a stakeholder, Leanne mentioned, there was a surface water stakeholder process that happened 3 or 4 years ago, where all these same discussions, I think, kind of were had, and the PPAC had similar discussions following up on that as well. Ultimately, they were trying to get to some specific language for the law, how do we improve it? The RBCs haven't necessarily come up with specific language because it's a really hard nut to crack. So we focus more on these overarching procedures. So maybe what Jeff is suggesting is probably getting too much into the weeds, but I like where he's going with it because I think ultimately that's what somebody needs if they're actually going to rewrite the law. They need that language. They need somebody to come up with those ideas. How do we do this? But it's probably too much for us to ask to do that.
I suggest we put the two top ones together again. Get rid of the bottom one. Bring the one from the other page over. And substitute that for the when you're eliminating that. So that we have, we now, they're right there. Right, so.
There we go. There we go. Just
I think that says what we want.
Yeah, we build on. Yeah, okay. All right, well, if you'll like that, then, we'll move forward. Again, you're going to get to read chapter 9 and react to it. And
Copy that book and put it in second.
Copy that bucket.
No, there's no
There we
confusion.
go. Next time I'm not right. I got all 3 colored buckets at home.
Are you?
you laugh, but
Mac Beatty did that.
that's what they did at the Saluda.
Upper Savannah.
Upper Savannah, yeah, Mac did. Actually, he just brought a red bucket. He wasn't interested in green or yellow buckets.
I got all 3 colors.
Okay,
Felt that for you.
okay, well, let's move on to this topic. There's discussion about, should there be differences, registrations and permits? Should ag operate under one system and everybody else operates under another? And there's been more disagreement on this, but the Broad, again, which didn't have much ag representation, felt like that should be the case. The Saluda hasn't agreed to this recommendation. The Upper Savannah said, no, we don't want to make it. We don't think there should be, we think there's reason that there should be registrations and permits. The PD, same thing, I think. They didn't have this as a recommendation.
I don't think we can talk about this without the ag guys.
Yeah, you're right.
And let's not debate it. You're not here.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah.
No, it's just
The
ag guys.
We're gonna just move this for later.
It is supposed to be
Yeah.
me moving on and
Okay.
coming back.
Yeah.
Oh, red is trash. You pay attention to yellow. Yeah.
This one is not as important for what Water SC has to do for their surface water report due to the Surface Water Study Committee at the end of January. But I think there's value in discussing it now so we can at least present to Water SC whether the RBCs feel like further funding is needed for both planning or, more importantly, even implementation of the initial phase of planning. So the Upper Savannah and the PD felt strongly that funding should be allocated to continue planning. And they've got specific things they want to work on, and they're identified in their implementation plans of their river basin plan. The Saluda hasn't finished considering this recommendation yet. They may approve it. I don't know. The Broad, I don't remember the Broad even discussing funding. Not that they weren't for it, but we never got into that topic for some reason.
But this is just limited to this route process, right? How about funding for the water entities that help so they can plan themselves? That's more important.
The next.
I think that's the next.
That's kind of the next one, yeah. So that implementation funding could include either planning or actually putting in infrastructure or monitoring or whatever they need money for. That's probably this one, right? So these kind of go hand in hand, but this one was focused on this process and this planning process or something like it.
What do you see the RBC doing in the future?
Water quality.
But the plan would be, the state plan would be developed
Right.
by the end of 2025. What would the RBC for past that?
So RBCs can continue to meet to work on aspects of their implementation plan. An example I'll give is the broad RBC has met twice to work on specific actions that they identified in their implementation plan. One example is they identified sedimentation of reservoirs as an issue they wanted to further study. So Spartanburg Water has been funding a study, which we've been helping with, to look at the impact of sedimentation and the loss of storage in their reservoir. And then we heard 2 weeks ago from scientists with RTI Institute for work they did in the Catawba that helped with land prioritization and how to best prioritize land to protect both water quantity, water availability, and water quality. And that was one of the broad implementation actions. They wanted to learn more about that process that was done in the Catawba and has been done other places by Upstate Forever to see if they should do something in the Broad Basin, either as a group or individual entities. So they're continuing to meet to work on some of these implementation actions that were part of their plan. And that's potentially what you all will do if you develop similar ones that you think are, worth studying. You help advance those. In Georgia, the river basin planning process has been going on for longer. Obviously, they've updated their plans twice now, every 5 years or 3 years. I can't remember. So they continue to get funding from the state to revisit demand projections and update models and do additional work based on the discretion of each regional council and at the direction of EPD.
I have an opinion on this one that's not positive. I won't vote against this one, but I find this self-serving that we should be funded. We say we, and I think it takes away from all of our other recommendations because I find it self-serving, but we think we should be funded to do more. I think if we're going to say what needs to be done and our customer, the legislature says, yeah, keep going, then we've done something well. We can say,
I actually agree with that.
yes.
There's a self-serving statement that we're reading.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it takes away from all of the other recommendations. I would vote against it because it's okay.
But you just don't want to say it. They need to recognize it themselves.
If we're good, they should recognize it.
Promulgate that if they think there's a value in the RBC, not the RBC themselves, but I want to get together and study sediment at the bottom of it.
I'm paying Clemson a bunch of money to do that.
No, I mean, it's, maybe the guys like you, guys and gals like Needle, and they want to continue it, but I think the state ought to determine whether they're
Your customer
resource.
Yeah.
My guess is this came before the announcement of waters.
Yes.
So like there's another layer that's now been added on top. So I don't know, whatever that entity is going to do, I think it's gonna have them dictating what this becomes. Yeah, that makes sense.
Well, so the PPAC was still in formation when this recommendation was originally developed. So there was an overarching planning body in place, but now there's a different one that has a different mandate to kind of speed up and finish the process, at least this phase of it.
So, but what the idea is that water has persists or is it just doing that plan and then it resolves?
I don't know. I heard
There's a time limit on it.
there's a time limit. Yeah, so I guess the governor's executive order set a time limit on the water SC group. Oh, that's another point. Yeah.
Funding for, we were unable to provide a model for our USDS contractor, and so the continuation of funding from the legislature would allow, city agency to do the work, maybe a model, and if there's specific model runs that are interested in, even down the line, if conditions change, additional development, or if there's something coming in that would likely affect the water resources and that type of work. I think that was the idea. Was working continually with the RBCs during the implementation period to see some of those ideas.
So I would agree that what we're talking about is sustaining this effort, this, not necessarily RBC, but the effort. And the effort that we're a part of began 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. And then we've heard the state explain there was this big gap, a decade plus, and that this process has picked up their efforts and allowed them to renew and update and expand. And I think some comment about the worthiness of this ongoing is what we should be doing. And implicit in there is some funding for it. Whether you say you got to feed the fish to keep the fish alive, I don't know. But you ought to say the fish really is good to have around.
But you're suggesting take out any mention of funding and just say you recommend that continued water
Yes, sir.
planning be
Yes,
performed.
and
Okay.
and it recognizes the worth of this enterprise, not the individual parochial me part of it.
Mhm.
I would accept that. I like that, but I think that's at the very end, our last. recommendation.
Yeah.
Sequencing
Yeah.
notwithstanding. So,
Yeah, okay.
Because I think the part of the recurring, not necessarily funding, but just for the state water planning activities is what's important here. Because of what is stated about what the state agencies are doing continuously. We might be helping out with that in the planning activities, but we know where the work is really being done too.
Right. So
Right.
you're suggesting it doesn't matter what the form of planning is, whether it be RBCs or just the state.
Yeah, whoever's doing
or-
whatever needs to be
Yeah.
done, it needs to be, this planning process needs to be continued because
So we could
we don't
say,
want this thing to be stuck on a shelf like so many planning processes do. They get stuck on a shelf and then they get stuck like it was several, for a decade. And not be touched. And that's not what they're supposed to be done. They're supposed to be looked at and continued to be worked on and updated. And because we know that things change and we want to make sure that we stay with the times and stay updated with that type of thing. So
Okay.
it needs to be worked on.
Yeah.
And I like that. I like the idea of just working on it.
I think that we should do it regionally too, by basin. I mean, there should be some sort of mention that there's basins or regional planning considerations made so that it's not just a statewide, because then you get into, okay, well, the state will consider it. And then it's like, well, then who? And unfortunately, I also think that maybe not recurring, but some mention of funding, or else they're just gonna say, okay, someone did it. Someone looked at it, someone did it. And if it's not recommended that there be some money put aside or some planning in, I don't know, I'm just of the belief that if you don't tell them how to do it to some degree, that no consideration at all will be paid. That no forethought or anything.
You're saying a little different than what I heard over here is that we shouldn't mention funding, but just mention the need to
It's not
continue.
necessarily funding. I don't like saying, you need to make sure there's a basin council with money. Cause that's self-serving, but say, put aside some money and a regional planning effort. Because that makes sense.
If you do it, it's gonna cost something, so that's.
Yeah.
It's implied. I don't know if we have to. Leave the horse to it.
I mean, it's South Carolina, I just feel like you need to tell somebody, put aside some money and some planning. Just
Let's
spell it out
Let's
a
put
little
that in
bit.
a yellow bucket and let's think about
Yeah.
that.
That's, yeah,
Let's think about that.
yellow bucket.
Sounds good.
Put a yellow bucket on it.
Okay. Just if I'm presenting these results to Water SC or somebody else's, just so we don't misrepresent what y'all have decided, is it does sound like there's consensus behind some type of planning at a river basin scale continuum. Is that a fair statement?
You could leave it like that, the green bucket. I mean, the money part wasn't my biggest thing. I just think that, I mean, that's a big that majorly, but,
Okay, well, we'll make the recommendation a little more eloquent and then we'll revisit it again. A lot of times we put things in kind of like a yellow and green bucket and we tweak one word and we present it again at the next meeting and then we say, okay, good, green bucket, move on. So
You could just start with continue state water planning activities, including river basin planning.
Green.
Everybody good with that? No mention of funding in green? Online people,
So green, the words.
words are green, yeah. Point.
Even add something to the front end of that, you know, due to the continued growth of, or anticipated growth of the state, whatever, just put a little bit of meat on the front end of it, just to show the importance of.
We can put that on the meat, or we can put that in the discussion behind it.
Discussion behind it.
Discussion
Yeah.
behind it. Okay, that,
Due to the.
South Carolina is growing rapidly.
Due to the expected and continued growth.
Water demand will continue to increase. And water demand will continue statewide.
these are more just notes. We will wordsmith it.
What did they look like?
The resources are finite.
No.
South Carolina
Oops,
full of-
infinite.
it's that's the response. Full of everything.
Okay. What about the one about implementation? So you all are gonna, after we're done writing recommendations, we're gonna write an implementation plan that helps move a lot of your recommendations forward. Do you want a specific recommendation about, hey, we've got this plan, we don't want to just sit on the shelf, we want the things that we've suggested to actually get done? A lot of those things require some type of funding. Do you want a recommendation to ask for money or recommend that a grant program be developed or something else? Do you want to just address that idea of how do we implement these strategies, or do you want to just leave it up to the state?
You never want to go nuts. Mandates.
So the river basin plans are not legislative or anything. So
Right.
I-
Not binding.
Okay, and then I've heard during a conversation that there are a lot of water agencies, utilities, whatever, don't have funding to comply right now and do studies and things like that. I think that's where the money needs to go. I agree that the local folks need the money that don't have it so they can comply with the current stuff that they're supposed to do right now.
Yeah, and that's what,
Drought management, whatever, I mean, not our river basin plan.
But there might be strategies that water utilities aren't gonna carry out, but DNR might carry out, or,
Yeah,
right?
whoever, I mean,
Yeah.
but I just heard lack of funding.
Yeah.
We talked about it for updating drought management or updating planning, but you didn't have the ability to do it.
Right.
even if I'm good. There's, so I think that is a recommendation we talked about in the past. So-
so, when we talk about water management strategies and select which ones we want to recommend, one of them that we may select could be like, oh, we think utilities should improve their water quality control and their audits, more efficiently use water. And to do that, they need funding to replace aging infrastructure. And that's something like this grant program would help fund.
But we're saying the grant program to help support the implementation and actions and strategies identified in each RBC plan. I mean, that's not a statutory thing. So what? I don't understand how that would work. We would give somebody a bunch of money and then look at the plan and they could decide, read through it. How would that?
Yeah, our action or our strategy and our implementation plan may be to help identify funding for low country or regional water system to update aging infrastructure. And they might use that, then they, might use that grant program to take some of that money and help defer the cost of that type of program or put in smart meters or.
Would you change from implementation of the actions and strategies identified in the state water plan?
Yeah,
In other words,
that's a document.
that's the document that will be approved theoretically by the legislature. So
You could, yeah, if that's what you want to do.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, because our RDC plan is not a document that. It's just a,
Anybody but us is going to approve it.
yeah, it's just a directional document that goes in state water.
Is Scott on still?
I'm here.
Yes, Scott, I think we've talked about this before. Is it the intent of or is it contemplated in the planning framework or any time before that? And maybe you know, Dean, that the legislature adopt the state water plan and approve it?
I think that's the hope. That's the hope.
Well, I mean, at the time, I think that was the goal. Yes. You know, when we first put the framework together and talked about updating the state water plan, I think that was the intention.
Okay, just curious. The state water plan that I helped prepare for Missouri and Connecticut, in both those cases, the legislature officially adopted them. They voted and approved them all.
So why don't we say approve state water?
State water.
No, we've got a second. In my library, I have 2 state water plans put out by DNR over the years, none of which ever were approved by the legislature. So we need to be specific about the fact that the expectation is that the state legislature will stand up and say, okay, we agree with this.
Does it need to say who needs to approve? Or is that?
I think it's. Maybe the governor, I don't know,
State water plan approved by.
the legislative, all right, say that. That's
The example that we gave here, the seed grant program, it does not provide a whole lot of money. I think it was only a couple $100,000 each year.
Yeah, and that's split up between applications from all the bases.
Right.
So it doesn't go to every base.
Right. So
It's
it was very modest, but it is help. I mean, they use the money.
It's almost prototype, in 3, 4, 5 in the state prototype, so.
Right.
And it's a very modest program, but it's significantly in that it's got visibility and some modest funding to go with it.
Right. So it's not a very significant part of the overall state water or state budget by any means.
Right.
It's pretty small in Georgia.
Yes.
But it's at least enough to get some things moving. I think is how they perceive it.
And Larry said also look at Sentinel landscape funding opportunities too.
Right.
So could it be with the umbrella strategy in mind, identify funding sources to support the implementation of actions and strategies in the legislative and for the state water plan? And it could be identifies funding sources, including the South Carolina legislature, to support public law.
So that would be one of your implementation actions, is to identify funding sources. I mean, I guess you can make it a separate recommendation, but to me, that's more of an action that
Well, this right now, we're establishing a grant program.
we're making a recommendation to the legislature to establish a grant program.
Okay, then the legislature should support the implementation of actions and strategies with funding. The key thing here is the funding, right?
Right.
One thing it doesn't do is say where the grants, I think your grant program for you, what, the whole group.
Well, in the example we gave here, it's to help local governments and water utilities. I think in Georgia, actually, it also could help ag. They've used it for some ag stuff, like put in deeper wells and things. Again, the tech center here was just an example. We could get specific about how we want it if we want to, about how
Just as an example.
Yeah, okay. Happy to go back to what you were suggesting.
So, just that they should fund it. For the implementation of actions and strategies.
Don't say establish a grant program, just say, hey, they should fund it.
Right.
Establish and define.
Who cares about what's the grant?
Now, there might be other grant programs already out there, like rural infrastructure.
Oh, yeah, there are. I mean,
Authority,
yeah,
that
but that's
could-
federal,
yes,
but
they
yeah.
should support it
Okay.
and fund it. If that's our general statement.
Yeah.
I don't know that.
I mean, so I might read that and just say, oh, you think
I think that's just.
everything should be funded, every action and strategy, yeah, should be funded.
It made the state
But-
water
but
plan,
I-
it's the plan.
Yeah, I guess you're right, though. Why would you put something there if you like, yeah, you don't have to fund this.
Yeah, it's in.
It's in here, but don't worry about funding.
It Made it to the state plan.
But do you need a statement like this then? Yeah.
I would say you do. It's something like this, not necessarily exactly this. Otherwise, it runs the risk of just being aspirational.
We just say.
And a lot of laws are passed just to be aspiration.
Yeah.
And they're not by design enforceable or long lasting.
Right. So the other one, the way it was written, was specific to, hey, we know that you might not be able to fund everything that's in these river basin plans or in the state water plan, but we really recommend you at least do some type of grant program to get some of this stuff going. I think that's what the intent of that recommendation was, acknowledging that there may not be funding
As
to
a
cover
start.
every implementation in the state water plan and river basin plans, but why don't you do a water resources specific grant that local governments, utilities, other water users could leverage to help advance some of this stuff that the RBCs have identified or the state has collectively supported.
What about if we say the South Carolina legislature should aid in funding actions and strategies identified?
I wouldn't know what that not people are. That's the easy broad.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of what I was getting at. But again, I'm not on the council. You guys are the council.
I
So
would like Dean's opinion on this, because he has 2 water plans in his library that have never been.
Approved. Yeah.
So do you think we ought to write a plan and then do the plan?
I think I prefer the language the way it was before, when it talks about a grant program, as John has suggested. Because we're gonna depend mostly for a lot of the stuff that has to be done here on the local governments, on the water utilities, on and agriculture. The people out there on the ground are the ones that are gonna have to do an awful lot of this. We haven't talked about funding, and we've not talked about funding additional science, for example, that may be needed, particularly on the Nolan side. It's gonna have to be done over a period of years to make judgments on what's happening. There may be special studies that need to be done, and all that stuff, but that's something else. To me, the original proposal to establish a program that will fund implementation of specific actions and strategies, a grant program to fund specific actions and strategies identified in the approved state water. And I think I would prefer to be specific about the grant program. That's what I emphasize, rather than a generic statement. Because that implies that somebody's going to have to approve grants, somebody's going to have to apply for grants. I mean, that's mostly going to be local government, local water utilities, farmers, other people trying to do stuff. That would be my recommendation.
What does the rest of the council think? Can you live with this as written? Do you support this?
I'd just like to see after the words support. Because that's an example. Just repeat the words or whatever means local governments. Help support local governments, farmers, whatever.
In the implementation.
Stakeholders.
Yeah. Support.
Or should we just say water users? Yeah, keep it general, not
Yes.
risk leaving somebody out by listing individual water users.
Just say implement
Yeah.
the actions and strategies.
And the examples for.
I think we need the word help just to support water users implement or to help. We don't need the word support, to help water users implement. And what were you saying then, Ken?
That's good.
Looks good.
Then example.
Yeah, okay. Everybody good with that? Yep. Everybody online good with that?
Got one that says yes.
And
Really?
online folks, if I don't hear from you, I'm assuming you're good. Silence is approval. Too late.
Jeez, that's too late.
Okay.
How many is that?
Larry said, okay, but our grant program is the only funding of it.
But is it a question? Our grant programs the only funding? No. So yeah, there are other funding mechanisms.
That's up to, the app.
Yeah,
There's
that's
other
up to the app.
opportunities out there.
Right.
We need a loan.
Yeah.
You can do it if you want.
I mean, just the, rural infrastructure, SRF.
But our statement says grant fund, so I think that's why he's asking. Should we say grant?
Yeah.
funds
Ag,
or
there's equip.
Grant
There's,
programs or other funding. I don't know.
okay, what about this first one that the Parad came up with, which is that the permitting process should consider the river basin plan and its outcomes and all the information that it considered when they're reviewing and issuing permits. Do you think?
It's not statutory. It's not, it's a plan, so guidance.
Right, but they're suggesting it should become part of the statutory thing.
What is alignment?
I think that's open to interpretation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, the river basin plan were never set up to be statutory directives. It would make you consultative. This is what we think. This is already. But now this is getting into alignment, which is almost a regulatory.
Well, I think that's the idea, is to say that the state regulatory process.
Should state water plan be agreed to, approve legislatively approved state water plan, I would agree, but not the river basin. I agree with
But the Beach River Basin.
Yeah.
Is part of the state water plan, but
But it's not a regulatory document. And when you say the word alignment, what does that mean?
Can we flip them?
Whose view?
Make the bottom one the bold and then the top one the explanation?
They're different.
They're kind of different, yeah. And I'm still not sure what the intent of the PDs was when they said water supply information should be considered. That's kind of broad, and without knowing what that discussion was, I'm not sure how to interpret it.
That's already.
Like-
They look at the permit.
That's kind of how I see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're already looking at safe yield, but maybe they were talking about something else. I don't know.
I think it's considering the safe yield and then the other is, I don't know, I must be reading them wrong because I'm interpreting it as when you're looking at permitting and regulatory users, what to be careful and their withdrawal returns and your resource policy.
So as discussed, and I don't remember if they settled on one or not, but kind of what we were talking about earlier, when new industry comes in, again, you would think that they would always check to make sure there's enough water available, but Greenville Water and some others suggested that doesn't always happen. They hear about it. They hear about it later on. Somebody going ahead and making a decision to move forward, but not have fully vetted whether there's enough surface water supply or groundwater supply. I find that hard to believe, but they said it's happened. Yeah. But they were working on a recommendation that encouraged new water users to get with local utilities to ensure the availability of supply now and into the future, given projected demands and availability. So basically, use information from the River Basin Plan, and considering demand projections, which are in the River Basin Plan that, now are collectively all there, and before only individual water suppliers may have done their own projections, but not on a basin-wide scale. So their recommendation that they're still working on was kind of a combination of these two, specifically pointed to like new large industries.
This is a question for Scott. Is the state water plan that's going to be approved by the legislature, river basin oriented? Will it have some chapters in it that have all the statistics and things?
Well, if it's written based on the outline of the planning framework, it's not going to necessarily be divided by river basin plan. There's an introduction, there's a chapter on policy and legislative recommendations, and that's going to be cumulative of all the RBCs. There's a chapter on planning process and program recommendations. There's a chapter on financing needs, which we talk about funding. There's a chapter on current and future water demands. There's a water availability assessment. There's water management strategies, drought response, implementation, and special topics. So all the river basin plan information gets grouped according to those topics and discussed in those chapters.
So this is actually referencing like the law,
But there's,
Yeah, that's the first bullet was basically saying it's
if
the
we talk
law.
about the permitting process, we're talking about the law.
Right, it's gonna, they're suggesting the law be changed to say that, hey, you need to reference the most current version of the river basin plan when you consider whether to give a permit or not.
As opposed to say the old and.
It didn't really say in addition to or as opposed to, it just said you need to consider what's in the river basin plan as part of the criteria for providing a permit. But it was pretty high level.
How would that work? If the river basin plan is out of statutory document. And the alignment is left up to I to be delivered, right?
There's a lot of subjectivity to there, I guess.
I think, no, I don't, I mean, you could pass it, you could green bucket it, I just don't think it holds water.
The bucket doesn't hold water. You can't put a green bucket with a hole in it.
it's called. Let me suggest that instead of saying the current river basin plan, in the previous one, we've talked about the state water plan. So let's say the state water plan there.
Yeah.
But it's no relation, but that's why I asked the question. It's no relation to the.
But isn't it going to do that anyway?
It's gonna have projections and demands and so.
But in a very general sense, the principles in theory that will emerge out of the state water plan will be a compilation of the recommendations that have come from the basins. And to the extent there are consistent recommendations, and the idea generally, I think, John, we're trying to push this, is that there's a lot of consistency in the recommendations coming from the river basin planning groups.
Yeah.
So there's because there are going to be individual things based upon the uniqueness of the basins, but in general, the state water plan effectively it's taking all the river basin plans and integrating them together to produce a single document.
If you think of a scenario that they're gonna evaluate a permit application and not align to the state.
That's what I was trying to think of, is where can I think of a specific instance where they could say, yeah, what you're proposing to do is not aligned with the state water plan. Maybe there are instances, but I'm having a hard time thinking of what that could be.
The biggest problem I see though with that though is with the actual permit. Is you're not looking at, because if the state water plan doesn't have the individual area separated, because the state's so different, the river basins are so different. If you got somebody permitting up in Spartanburg, but you don't have that specific area in the state water plan, you may have the river basin council plan, but you don't have the in the state water plan specified enough. They're not going to be able to understand what's specific enough to be able to make these recommendations or understand what's the withdrawals and what's the returns and what's all that.
Yeah,
I
think that's an important point. And when the broad RBC came up with this, they were thinking about that specific information. An example might be like in the broad, they may say, well, the modeling showed us that on the Pacolet River system, which feeds the Broad River, there's projected to be a lot of water use. And although we don't see any projected shortages, we're seeing a lot more increasing frequency of times when the Pacolet River drops below minimum stream flows. But all those guys are grandfathered, so it's not really their problem. But you know, that suggests there's stress in that part of the basin along the Pacolet, and that should be considered when permitting a new water user. Maybe from, ecological
Is
health.
that information gonna be in the state water permit? It's
No,
not, so
Not that
that's
level
why
of
they're
detail is
bringing it
what I'm
up.
getting at.
But
Yeah,
the river
that was-
basin plan is gonna be somewhat static, so it's not gonna, how often is that gonna be updated? So
Well,
at some point, will it be,
it was contemplated that these would be updated every 5 years, kind of like Georgia has been doing, but it's unknown whether there's going to be funding or that will happen, every 5 years.
so 15 years from now, you can assess something. from
Against a 15-year-old, yeah, that wouldn't work,
But
obviously.
that's kind of what it said.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's putting a lot of pressure on the permitting process. If it doesn't exist. And we're trying to get rid of the grandfathering, and now we're saying new permitters, not only, these guys over here have all the water they want, but if you want it, now we gotta look at withdrawals, returns, resource conservation, and how you can yes them.
Well, look,
That's a lot.
their
A lot to put on.
organizational chart too, there's
Mhm.
all the vacancies.
I mean, is there any other state that puts that on the permit process? All those different elements besides withdrawals, the returns, the resource conservation, and what your drought response plan is going to be if you're level 4 drought, and what your permit then gets halved, or is that what that means?
Mhm. I can't think of any examples, but I can only think of a few states where I know about their plans and their regulations, so. But no, is
I know in California, we don't give it's almost like a conditional permit, right? So if we're in the drought response, number 4, whatever, the permit's cut, and what that means, this, it's a very, it's very tough to do. Maybe we should ask the state permit folks if that's even feasible. I don't want to recommend something that doesn't make
Yeah.
sense to me.
I don't know, Joe or Leanne, if you heard that, what, from your opinion, do you think that this type of, if this was written into the law, would that even be doable? Would you have trouble interpreting it and applying it? They might have.
Hey, sorry, I missed that. What was the question?
The question was the first bullet on the screen. If you were as a regulator required to issue a permit based on alignment with the river basin plan, what do you think that would be problematic? Would you question how that might happen? What are your thoughts on that?
So we would, in order to align a permit decision with recommendations in a plan, that would need to be something stated in our regulation.
Right.
So the recommendation would be to include a change to our to the regulation that would include during our review process to include review of the basin plan associated with the permit, request, basically. So if it's in, depending on the area, but that would have to be a change to the regulation or, based on how we conduct our assessment evaluations.
Right.
Currently, I wouldn't be able to, with the current legislation in place, I wouldn't be able to do that. But if that was a recommendation to change it, that would have to be a change. Yeah.
So that's what the recommendation is. We're just asking if that was in place, if that was part of the regulation, do you think it's problematic to try to figure out if there's alignment with the river basin plan when you're determining whether a permit should be issued or not?
Well, and I'll keep going. With respect to withdrawals, returns, resource conservation, and drought response. You have to consider all those factors when issuing a permit on each basin.
Right. So it sounds like it'd be a pretty complex issue that we'd need to look at. Because there'd be a whole.
Yeah, it's not a black and white criteria as the problem.
Right. No, correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
And having to make judgments like that based upon non-black and white criteria almost guarantee you a lawsuit.
Yeah, litigation, right.
I mean,
That's one of the concerns I've had with the recommendation. I like the idea of the recommendation, but in practice, I feel like it's opening you up to litigation.
Yeah. But if you were to say, if you were to eliminate that last portion of the sentence and simply say that the water withdrawal permitting process should specifically assess the permit application's alignment with the current state water plan. Yeah, of course. No,
Legislatively approved state.
legislatively approved. State law.
Yeah.
I mean,
That makes sense.
because essentially what has to happen is if the legislature approves it and says, you will do X. And then ultimately, DES is going to have to rewrite the regulatory program to accommodate those things. So it's, I think that's what we want, isn't it? I mean, that's the idea here. We're writing the plan. We want them to assess the permit application's alignment with the plan we're producing. Because if they're not going to do that, why the hell are we doing this? I mean, that's my perspective. We're doing this because we want the regulatory decisions at the state level, because they're the ones that make those decisions, to consider the recommendations that are coming in from our work, all our work in the utility base. Now, there are a million other things that happen at the local level and all these other things, but a big chunk of this is going to be how water was allocated and managed at state government level.
Okay. What does the rest of the RBC think about the rewritten statement there, recommendation?
Certain the word legislative approved, but I couldn't. We're consistent.
Yep, that's good.
Anybody not like the recommendation? Online folks, can you live with this?
Yes.
I could live with it.
All right, sounds like we're gonna green bucket that. You guys are just cruising.
This is.
We are closely getting to 2:00. I don't think this took 2 meetings of discussion in the Edisto about mean and median, and we're not providing you all the detailed data behind it. And I don't think you want to dive into this, so just kind of venture to guess. You don't want to touch that. Good.
I could get into it, but you don't want me to.
No.
Not here, not now.
This next one, I think we'll wait until we hear more about groundwater, decide if we want recommendations around, deeper wells or whatever. So I don't want to touch that one either. And then these last 3 were ones that, were very specific, and we could spend a lot of time talking about these, but I don't think we're going to reach consensus on the.
Can I add a thing that's not on there that
Yeah.
I think is really particularly affecting our basin? Is the impact of Georgia to us is, I'm not sure everyone else has that same impact. If you look at the lower Savannah River, between the largest cities are on the Georgia side, the largest users are on the Georgia side, the future growth really is on the Georgia side, big water. And we don't talk about Georgia at all. And so if we do all this planning and we save all this water, and I think that was quite asked earlier, is Georgia going to take it? If they did the analysis, said, look at all this water is available.
Savannah.
There has to be some interface that we have to recommend, that it has to align in a strong manner to the two states.
And the Hilton folks, they're getting a lot of the water from the ground and they're sucking it out and causing seawater intrusion. Forget the surface water, it's groundwater. It's probably the problem. So I think that needs to be addressed. I'm not sure where how.
We have not made a recommendation of that, the strengthening or kind of legally bind that connection. If you look at how Georgia, Alabama, and Florida dealt with their water problems, we have to have some strong connection in the lower Savannah to Georgia, because they are bigger than us.
Yeah,
We have that problem in Will of North Carolina, but that's not our problem. Well, it is in a sense, in that Savannah originates in North Carolina, but that's the Upper Basin state problem. It does seem to me that we ought to consider absolutely a recommendation to formalize our relationship with Georgia with respect to water resources management.
Right, water land.
Water planning, water resources management. Have a consulting process where DES meets with their people on a regular basis. We're even considering that if we continue to exist, we are meeting with their equivalent group over there. Staff is constantly in contact. And so I'd rather wait till the next meeting to do that. I think we need to do it, but we need to think about it.
Yeah.
And how it should be expressed.
So the Upper Savannah RBC was discussing and debating pretty much identical recommendation that you just made at their last meeting. We're going to pick that up at their meeting in their next week, basically. Doing some type of collaborative planning, compact or something with the Savannah Upper Ogeechee Council on their side of the river. We've talked about, where has that been done? The Catawba Water Management Group is the example because it includes North Carolina and South Carolina. And it was part of the settlement agreement, I think, with North and South Carolina that they would collectively work to develop a integrated water resources plan or water resources plan for their basin. So there's meat behind that regional planning group, which covers 2 states.
I think it's really prominent in our basin. It's bigger than, I think, most of our other recommendations. If we don't deal with Georgia, we're.
Yeah, one of the things that happened here 30 years ago, maybe 35 years, was a real effort on the part of South Carolina to enter into a compact with Georgia. And we were driven principally by the fact that Atlanta, you go back to Atlanta's history, and during the drought of 2002, 2001, Lake Lanier was down basically to 1 day's supply.
It was fishing off an old stadium.
It was, and so there was an enormous amount of pressure that was starting to build in Georgia to come across into South Carolina, into the Savannah Basin, not necessarily South Carolina, but into the Savannah Basin, and do a pump back of significant water out of the Savannah Basin over into the basin that served Atlanta. And so there was a lot of conversation starting to occur about the desirability of a compact that effectively would very specifically, just like the Colorado River Compact does, allocate very clearly the water resources between the 2 states.
Not that anybody abides by it.
Exactly. You know too much.
But yeah, no, I'm it's kind of shocking there isn't. Yeah, it's
At least to be a basis upon which you could, if a lawsuit, at least something you could play all the day. But I think we do need to address it.
Okay.
And I think that's.
Well, it'd be interesting to hear what the Upper Savannah comes up with.
Yep.
If I'm going to water SC, I mean, that ought to be the recommendation that we can bring like today.
Because the new Hunt plant was up there in Bryan County, and I mean, there's Vogel 2, 3 and 4 came on. I mean, there's lots of water uses on that side of the river far exceeds our side of the river. And,
Well, we're building 200,000 houses. Just over the border.
Yeah.
And just they're involved.
it's, I think we have to, and I think it has to be something enforceable. It has to be.
Okay, yeah, we'll include that in presentation discussion with Water SC that you felt that some type of regional planning that includes both states is necessary and important.
At some point, is it worth considering parsing out corporate ag, large corporate ag from agriculture?
And regulation.
From a water standpoint, yes, sir.
Well, from water planning or from regulation or
Permitting and planning and permit.
planning and permitting. You want to make a recommendation around that? You can offer it up.
I think we should consider.
Yeah.
What, I don't know the details of it, and I don't know how to design it.
We'd be glad to see what you produced.
Yeah, I agree. I think it'd be important to have
It
that.
is.
To get into it, but I think we need someone from out here that will help us get.
Oh, I agree. I do.
Help us
I'm
dig
speaking on behalf of
Yeah.
somebody who's not here, basically.
Well, I mean, I think that we should dig into it, but I think we need their input. Cause I remember Brad's talk, like they don't actually use their water that they're permitted at all. It's pulling lots of recovered surface water. He's
But
not pulling-
he also said something in the first meeting that I attended, when we were down in, he talked about the permitting process. When we listed our problems,
Uh-huh.
he talked about the timing of the permitting process. Was not helpful to him, so.
Yeah,
We haven't addressed that anywhere in our conversations. Do you remember that? You wrote it down as a list of issues to be resolved at the end of the first session.
Yeah, we can bring that up during
Because that might,
recommendation.
there may be some recommendations come out of those problems that we've learned earlier.
Yeah.
Brad.
Yeah. And actually, that's a good reminder. That's kind of typically,
the other brother too, golf cart brother, he mentioned how like, he doesn't even pull, he doesn't use a lot of water either because he uses his pumps and stuff. But no, they're permanent, and you would, like, I came in thinking those would be the biggest water users, and neither of them were the biggest water users. So their input would be helpful.
okay. So just to wrap up, since, we've started in the recommendations development process, which is bringing us to, kind of near the end of our planning process. We've done a great job today, already deciding on a number of policy, legislative, and regulatory recommendations. So that's good. We're going to double back in January or February and also consider planning process and technical recommendations. And would you like to start from scratch, or do you want to see what the other RBCs have come up with for those? For planning process recommendations that have to do with this planning process, state water planning process, and then technical recommendations, which are kind of all encompassing of everything else, which could be, hey, we need more monitoring here, or we need to go study the impacts of sedimentation, or I can give you examples from the other RBCs, but that's what I'm asking. Do you want to do it kind of organically from what we've discussed, or do you want to see what some of the other RBCs have come up with?
I kind of like to see what the other RMCs are.
Yeah.
Quicker to.
It's quicker.
Yeah.
It's
I mean,
quicker.
that's
We have to start.
Let me be the-
Still have to look at our month.
But let me be the contrarian a little bit here, because I'm good at that.
You are good for that.
My wife tells me that.
Does stifle our creativity.
So so what happens is, I would like to see what they want to do, but I would like to see that second.
Yes.
Because like these ideas that we just put here. There are probably 6 of those that we've been kind of driven so much that we're kind of at the end and we're tired and we won't pop them. If we all go home and think of things and bring them up, they may already be in there.
And then we can look at their wording and not debate it and all that.
Yeah.
Sometimes we put a time in them.
Yeah.
Yeah. let's do that.
Agreed.
Yeah.
How about, you let us go back and forth for a lot of amount of time, and if we don't come up with, we
I
have
have
to
a
like
thought
circle
that
back
actually would be on.
and come back.
That's what we've tried to have been doing in
Like
other.
just completely skip to the next and come back again.
Yep.
That same day to revisit.
I'm not gonna be attending in February, so if you plan it for them.
Oh, let's do it. No, I'm just kidding. I think it all helps drive us to get system productive.
Okay, we can take that approach. What I'll do is, I'll probably
Do it in February.
I'll prepare a summary of all the other recommendations. I'll bring it as a handout. I'm not going to give it to you. Well, I want you all, your homework is to think about these types of recommendations you want to cheat and go look at the already published edits abroad, I can't stop you. That might spur your mind, but think about what recommendations you want to make. Go back to our first meeting where we talked about issues and concerns in the basin. That might spur some recommendations. Go back to our objectives and our vision statement. You might want to develop recommendations that help us meet those objectives in that vision statement. But come prepared to the next couple of meetings with any recommendations that you think are important that we want to include in chapter 9 of our plan. I'd much rather put a recommendation out here that you all propose than try to just come up with them on the fly. It's more efficient for you guys to say, hey, I think we need a recommendation about this or that. Let the RBC decide if they like it or if it needs any wordsmithing, and then move on.
Can I ask for one more? Favor is not the right word, but when you send things for me to read the day before, and I read my email at 9 o'clock at night, it's good. So
He's got one eye open.
Yeah, no, I recognize that.
but that happens regular. So if I'll do that homework, if you help.
Get them out earlier. Yeah, I'm trying to get things out earlier. Falling behind the holiday.
I asked for a favor. I didn't say I didn't do it. So I just I try to do what you guys ask. But if you give me a short time, I'm retired and everybody seems to want my time. So it's not free.
ADHD is not your superpower.
I can't tell you about my superpower.
So just looking at our schedule really quick.
John had it.
Oh,
I'm sorry, I'm just gonna
Seems
ask,
like it for me.
field trip, if there's one in this time frame, does it fall in between, does it fall after? Or do we just give up on field trips at this point?
no, we had talked about putting field trips in between meetings.
Okay.
The last meeting, because we're kind of crunched for time now.
Right,
So if you all are still interested in visiting Savannah Riverside, I was going to reinitiate the conversation with Jeff. And Bill, if you want to be part of it, or at least that one, and we'd probably do that sometime in the March to May timeframe. Is everybody still interested in doing that potentially? I mean, when I asked the question last time, there were. So, yeah, okay. So is Jeff still on? Yeah, Jeff. What do we need to do to figure out a date between March and May?
So I just need to connect you with our external affairs people so we can kind of come up with a date.
Okay. All right, I'll shoot you an email, maybe with some proposed dates that don't conflict with other RBCs and Water SC meetings, and
Okay.
we'll try to find one, and then we'll see if there's availability on your end, and then see if that works for the RBC.
and for those that have already submitted the paperwork, is that sufficient, or
No.
you're gonna do it again?
You gotta do it again.
Gotta do it again.
I live there, so
Let's ask it.
I'll take his word for it. So by March, we want to hopefully finish our recommendations. So, think about the discussion we had today, which is a great discussion. We made good progress. The Saluda has been talking about recommendations for a good part of 5 or 6 meetings. Not completely in every meeting, but they spent a lot of time on it. We're a little more pressed for time. So we want to try to spend January, February, and then wrap that up in March. And in the meantime, we're going to.
Upper, lower? Is that
Oh, yeah.
in the scope, not in the scope? And then as we've had this conversation about Georgia, that becomes really topic 1, I would think.
I keep suggesting that we should have an IRC meeting, and I think early January is the appropriate time so that you can talk about consistent recommendations where you want to see them, or
Unity of effort.
Unity of effort, right. I was talking to Dean about that earlier. There's, like one topic that the Upper Savannah made a recommendation on has to do with encouraging South Carolina to support and help fund the comprehensive plan that the Army Corps started, and then ran out of money and ran out of time. So they just ended it, but they had developed different alternatives that involve changing kind of their drought releases. And there was promise, and that looked good, but the alternative that they identified was, seemed to be good, but then they just ran out of money and said, we're not going to do it because the process is over. We don't have money. So that's one recommendation that they've made. That affects the Lower Savannah. I think it'd be worth seeing if you all are with that. So again, we'll try to schedule at least maybe a virtual IRC meeting in January. Okay, I think that's all I have.
All right.
Anything else? Yeah.
No, just a reminder that our January meeting is the second Thursday
Right.
of the night, not the second.
Oh, and then we may pick a new location maybe, but we're still trying to figure that out. But if we did it in Walterboro or was it Ridgeland?
Or Richland.
Ridgeland,
Anyone have strong objections to either of those towns?
A lot of people have left.
Yeah, sorry.
It's just,
They don't get to check.
Yeah.
well, for,
it's, but, I mean, this place wasn't as cold as Estill last year. And so,
Well,
That's
yeah,
true.
well, I guess that was this year.
Yeah, it was this year.
It was terrible.
I'm looking to y'all because obviously you're from, and that doesn't get you closer, although
So
I
it's
don't think it's
probably-
much
It's probably
difference.
12 songs further on my playlist.
What's your drive time here?
90 minutes.
Yeah, and Walterboro was 145 and Ridgeland is 2.
Yeah, it's all right. I just,
okay.
if I go to Richmond,
Blackfield's a nice place.
I may just stay on the coast.
Richland.
Blackfield's a nice place. Black.
Do you have any place on the line?
The Clemson, the Clemson area.
Clemson area, yeah.
It's farther for those guys.
Just me to Miller County.
There you go.
We're waiting on it.
Okay.
And then you could always mix it up.
Good mix it up too, yeah.
Then it gets confusing, but how hard is it to know?
Myrtle Beach, if I'm driving.
So just stay tuned, that's all.
Yeah, we'll let you know. We may not meet here again. We may meet somewhere else. Okay, we'll let you know.
Are we met?
Just check me on that.
Thank you, everyone.
Be careful what you ask.
Motion to adjourn. You got it. Got the second.
We gotta go to the Christmas party now. After